Well, let's dig into this sucker. What is happening, everybody? This is Wrong Reel, episode 386, podcast for hardcore cinephiles, where we tackle everything from
Jean-Luc Godard to Jean-Luc Picard.
And today we're going to be tackling arguably the most important filmmaker of the second half of the 20th century. I feel like there's a small Volkswagen full of luminaries, but we are, of course, referring to the great Stanley Kubrick, a filmmaker who, in spite of the fact that he's been dead nearly 20 years, seems to get more awe-inspiring and more relevant with each passing year. And now we have the 50th anniversary of 2001 and a brand new documentary, Filmworker. And it just seems like if you're a young filmmaker today, you might still think that somehow Stanley Kubrick is still active and in action. He just seems to his shadow looms very large over film culture.
And most of his films continue on anniversaries to get re-released in theaters or get brand new 4K remasters. So very few filmmakers, I think, get their entire catalog consistently re-released every time some type of anniversary happens. So that's a testament to the staying power of his films. And this is great because it means it is reaching younger, newer generations, and they're being seen in the way that they deserve to be seen on a big screen. So it's
yeah, I can still recall that really crummy DVD box set that came out like in '99.
Yeah.
And it was just wretched, most pitiful, like disgusting transfer you've ever seen with like hair on them and scratches. And it's like, how did Warner Brothers like approve putting this out there? Thankfully, due to people like Leon Vitali, we do have these pristine, beautiful versions of the majority of Stanley Kubrick's films.
Yeah, and they're doing it yet again with the 50th anniversary of 2001. They are releasing not just a new 4K remaster of the film, which will be coming out on Blu-ray and on digital HD, but also an unrestored 70 millimeter version of the film will be sort of going around the country, sort of like an old-fashioned road show, playing in select cities. And this is essentially the first time anyone has ever seen a 70 millimeter print of the film since it was first released in 1968.
I've never seen it in the theater at all. I've seen this movie many times, but I remember the first time I saw it was on a pan and scan VHS cassette, just the sides chopped off on the world's smallest television with like 8 noisy college kids crammed into a room. And I remember my favorite memory from that first screening, we're sitting there watching it, we're getting so into it, we're so excited. And during the whole Dawn of Man sequence, this one poor girl, I will not name her name, but she's from St. Louis, Missouri. She was a friend of a friend. She's, how'd they get the apes to do all that? We were not necessarily the kindest teenage boys around, so we gave her some good-natured ribbing for that slip on her part. But even then, under the worst circumstances possible, we were still transfixed by this movie.
Well, that's sort of an insult to, or maybe it's also a compliment to Daniel Richter, who played the ape Moonwatcher, because he did a good job. He made it look real. So, sometimes good acting, in this case, sort of miming, that's what he was really doing in a costume, in an ape costume. A lot of people just couldn't tell the difference. So it's a remarkable feat if you can do that. But looking back on it now, after seeing the film a dozen times over the years, I can tell that these are not real apes. But
I would hope so.
As a young child, seeing it for the first time, I didn't think about it either.
So you caught it as a kid?
Yeah, I saw it on. My dad really liked this film. My dad had the original LP soundtrack, which I remember listening to, and so I kind of heard all of the classical music before I even saw the movie, and I knew it was associated with the movie, but I didn't know why. I didn't know the sort of backstory to it. But yeah, I saw it like you on a VHS tape sometime probably in the mid to late 80s. And surprisingly, I also saw on VHS around the same time the sequel, 2010, which at the time I actually liked more. I thought it was more action-packed and more...
I've never seen it, but I understand there's more narrative to it.
Yeah, there's more narrative. It has a definitive ending, or it explains what's happening.
Kids
more.
Don't do well with abstract concepts.
So this is a movie for me, sort of like a fine wine, where it has gotten better with age, with each viewing. It didn't quite... I didn't dislike it. I just didn't understand it or appreciate it on the level that I later did once I started learning about film language.
I think I like it the most yet yesterday when I watched it again.
Yeah.
Every time I revisit it, I always forget just how awe-inspiring and how open to interpretation it is, how just its soaring ambition. It makes most science fiction seem so trivial and childish in comparison.
And it really was up until that point, and that's something that both Arthur C. Clarke, who co-wrote it with Kubrick, a lot of people think it's based upon his book, but they were writing the movie as they essentially were making it, and then the book came out after the movie.
Yeah, they kind of used the Sentinel as a jumping off point.
Exactly. It was a shorter story that they used as a sort of basis, but really the only thing that movie had in common was the idea that they found this object on the moon that was sort of like a symbolic representation.
It was almost like an alarm system allowing an alien intelligence to know, oh, man's left Earth.
Right.
So just let's be aware of them. But you don't really know what their designs may or may not be.
Which is based upon, I think, the sort of theory that after the nuclear testings of the 40s, well, the actual detonations in Japan and the continued testing throughout the 50s, that's when there was this wave of sightings of unidentified objects in the sky. So a lot of science fiction writers decided that perhaps these alien beings out in the far reaches of space were seeing this as a benchmark in human civilization. Like they knew we were here.
It's like in First Contact when we first achieved warp speed.
Right.
The Vulcans like, oh shit, humans aren't just cave people.
Exactly. So the fact that we achieved the ability to split the atom was the sign that we were ready to be visited, that we were worth observing now. Like we had sort of gone beyond this sort of primitive man stage in our development. And that's, I think, really what this film is about. It's about, more than anything, it's about the evolution of man as a whole.
The limitless potential of us as a species, but also just the limitless potential, I think, of the human imagination. I don't know if space travel has ever been depicted in a more classic and spiritual and just awe-inspiring way. It almost ruins science fiction when you watch it, because you realize so rarely do we even begin to scratch the surface of the potential of this wonderful, beautiful genre. I feel like too often it's just thinly veiled escapist fantasy. And that's fine. I love and adore all that stuff. But goddamn, this is a fucking meal that you can revisit over and over and over again. And it never gets old. It never spoils. It just seems to get more rich, more complex. And Stanley Kubrick, he seems to have made a career out of expanding the limits of the art form and improving the grammar of the art form, showing what the art form is truly capable of, where it almost makes every film that came before it seem like it's from the Stone Age by comparison.
Yeah, I mean, going back to sort of what Clarke and Kubrick their goal really was in the mid-'60s when they first started talking about this, because it took over 3 years to make. They were really looking at the sci-fi landscape at the time and saying, this is, mostly for kids. It's like they're like horror movies. They're sort of cheap B movies.
At best, you're going to get Forbidden Planet.
Right. Maybe or The Day the Earth Stood Still. Was sort of had an important message about a nuclear annihilation and all of that. So, but they still sort of had a cheapness to them.
There's a pulpiness, even with Twilight Zone, which I fucking love and adore. Yeah. There's a pulpiness to it.
Exactly. So I think they both were saying, okay, there's an opportunity here to make the first sort of serious sci-fi movie. Now, The Planet of the Apes came out the same year, and that was another sort of very different science fiction movie, but it attempted to sort of take the sci-fi genre in a new direction as well, and sort of a more serious and, it's both have apes in them, so there's some
which
similarities.
Apparently really fucked with people's first impressions of 2001, because 2001 initially was met with like open mockery, and a lot of people misunderstood it, but a lot of people were thrown by the Dawn of Man sequence because they'd just seen Planet of the Apes, like, oh, is this kind of like Planet of the Apes? And like, no, it's nothing like Planet of the Apes.
Not at all, yeah.
But people were walking out of it, and critics were absolutely abusing the hell out of it. I mean, I have even though I love and adore and respect her as a critic, I was rereading Pauline Kael's review of the movie, and it makes me actively dislike her as a person. I'm like, but it also makes you stop and wonder, what are my blind spots today where I'm refusing to acknowledge or even notice something that 50 years from now might be regarded as a great masterpiece? But
no, that's a great point, and I think a lot of filmmakers sort of use this if they've had a movie that didn't quite connect,
like Martin Brest and Geely. That's my 2001.
Yeah, exactly. Or like Darren Aronofsky's Mother, just did not connect with audiences or with critics really. So I'm sure he's looking at this saying maybe in 50 years,
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's fine. This has happened to me as well. There are numerous films where I didn't really care for or just didn't love it, and then over the years revisiting a film, I totally changed my opinion of them. So, and I think critics do the same thing.
Although it's hard because you get older and more set in your ways, and you get more arrogant, and also with online culture, with people fighting over movies now. I mean, once you fired a lot of shots at your adversaries online, it's very hard to say, you know what, maybe I was just being a dick, and maybe I should revisit what I was saying earlier. Yeah. But I have this great book here in front of me. It's called it's got a very bland title, but I assure you it's not a bland book. The Making of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was released in 2000. Martin Scorsese is one of the editors on it. And it basically compiles every scrap of information about the making of the movie at that time, as well as reviews. And it's got a lot of interviews with Kubrick. It's got interviews with Arthur C. Clarke. It's got filmmaking diaries. It's even got some interesting memories from Jay Cox, who was hanging out with Kubrick at the time, but an absolutely vital resource. But it does have a section with a lot of the reviews at the time, and we see how the majority of the quote-unquote vanguard of film criticism did not understand it, openly hated it, and really shat on it. But that after months and months and months, slowly but surely, these dope-smoking, LSD-crazed youths started sneaking into the theater, and theater started reporting back to the studio saying, "Hey, there's like there were 5 people last night.
Something's happening here.
There were
like
10
there's
people
this
today."
new audience.
It just kept growing and swelling, and it got to the point where John Lennon even admitted he would go see this movie every week. I mean, just a different model back then, where movies were allowed to slowly build and grow, whereas now it's like you're opening weekends, everything.
There weren't nearly as many films, first of all, so films did take their time. I've said it before. I think Star Wars opened on, I think it was 27 screens.
That ain't a lot. Now it'd be 4,000.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it eventually reached thousands of screens over the years, but it just took years for it to expand. And people would drive, states or towns over to find a theater playing it. I think there's something sort of exciting about that concept of access being difficult, sort of building anticipation. But then again, of course, a film better be good after taking the extra time to find a place to watch it. But that's the same thing with indie films today. Yeah. People will go into cities to find a theater to see a movie like Filmworker, which is only playing, at the Metrograph starting this Friday. So if you want to see that and you're in the middle of the country right now, you're out of luck.
I caught it at the New York Film Festival because I had that privileged access. But one thing I like about the fact that 2001 failed initially, it forced Kubrick to promote the movie and do a lot of interviews. Kubrick did not like doing a lot of interviews and a lot of promotion, but he realized, if I don't really fight on behalf of this film now, it might just die a very
There's a famous,
death.
I think, Playboy interview.
It's great.
Is fantastic.
It's essential reading.
So revealing, and it's just interesting. It makes you realize how different Playboy, how it was perceived back then as this sort of prestige publication for the sophisticated working man.
I got my coffee table book. It's the first 50 years of Playboy right behind me, and it's not just pictorials. It actually is a lot of these interviews with these great filmmakers.
It was like, I'm sure the publicists at Warner Brothers were like, you have to do Playboy. That's your mark. That's one of your audiences. You have to try to get them excited about the movie. And it's a great interview. He really, in a way, in that interview, I have it, I highlighted it in my notes, but he kind of gave away his opinion as to what the ending means in that interview in sort of a not direct way. He makes some comments about what he thinks about, evolution and extraterrestrials, and you can interpret it as sort of his interpretation.
But also in the same interview, he speaks about his reluctance to articulate it, because the whole point of creating an abstract visual movie with very minimal dialogue is just how it lends itself to an infinite number of interpretations.
Well, you mentioned Pauline Kael. I also revisited the 2 reviews that Roger Ebert wrote, who I often agree with. On rare occasion, I don't. He did not like Full Metal Jacket, which I love. But in this case, I really agree with both of his reviews. He saw it at the first premiere screening in 1968. That was his first year as a film critic. So he was a young Roger Ebert, and he saw the initial screening, which Kubrick completed just in time. He basically, because he wouldn't fly, he took the Queen Elizabeth across from England and edited on the Queen Elizabeth, the film, and continued editing the film on a train cross country to Los Angeles just in time. It played, and people apparently walked out of the theater because they were unhappy. Rock Hudson apparently was saying, "What the hell is this movie about?" and stormed out of the theater. And so this was the only time apparently that the full film was seen. He cut, I think, 16 or 17 minutes out of the movie after that, which has not, to my knowledge, been available or seen since, because it felt just too long at that point. I think it was 2 hours and 45 minutes where they brought it back to 225.
It's not a briskly paced film.
Yeah.
I can understand it, but the fact that Kubrick never put it back in makes you think maybe those 19 or 18 minutes deserve to get cut, perhaps.
Yeah, I think one of them was an extended. He mentions it because this was the actual review he wrote in 1968, and then he also revisits it in 1998. So 30 years later, he sort of revisits his original review. Again, these are all on RogerEbert.com. They're worth reading. They're definitely very interesting, because you can get a sense of the initial impression as well as sort of the retrospective look back on the film after you've had a chance to analyze it, or countless people have analyzed it. But yeah, I mean, he said one thing that I think is really interesting. In 1968, when everyone was unsure what this movie was about, the book hadn't come out yet.
Shitting on it from a great height.
Yeah, and the book hadn't come out, so no one really knew. He wrote, "What Kubrick is saying in the final sequence is that man will eventually outgrow his machines, or be drawn beyond them by some cosmic awareness. He will then become a child again, but a child of an infinitely more advanced, more ancient race, just as apes once became, to their own dismay, the infant stage of man." It's like he grasped something that people are still debating about today in that initial viewing that I think is fascinating. It just sort of shows there's a reason why he became one of the most successful, most, at least in terms of sort of populist awareness. With he and Siskel really made film criticism popular in the 80s. Early
yeah,
80s.
Even as a kid, I knew who the hell they were when I didn't give a fucking damn about film history or film criticism.
Everyone kind of knew that 2 thumbs up thing, and everyone would occasionally catch their show when it was on late at night. So they did contribute that. They may have not been the most sort of critical. Like Pauline Kael was maybe a slightly more intellectual critic, of that same kind of era, or
perhaps even a stick in the mud.
Yeah, maybe.
Given her review of 2001.
Yeah, that's true. Although she did, who was it? She made some very good predictions in her career. I think about both Spielberg and Tom Cruise. I think she said this guy is going to be the biggest star of all time. Or like she definitely had some, but everyone gets it right a couple times.
Yeah, broken clock's right twice a day. But going back to that Playboy interview, what I loved was Kubrick's talking about how people were taking drugs and going to see this. And on one hand, that was a good thing because it's one of the things that helped make this. I mean, this was an abstract, complicated, big-budget movie that somehow became a ginormous runaway success, which is very, very rare in film culture.
Yeah, it tapped into that sort of psychedelic culture that was popping up at the time.
But on the topic of LSD, he said something. He said, "It tranquilizes the creative personality, which thrives on conflict and on the clash and ferment of ideas," which obviously, that idea alone is pretty revolutionary in the days of Twitter. Everyone's like, "You got to agree with me or I'll kill you and destroy you," blah, blah, blah. But then he said, "Perhaps when everything is beautiful, nothing is beautiful." And I can remember thinking that back in college, hanging out with I had a little bit of an infatuation with hippie chicks, and everything was always beautiful, man. I was like, it can't all be beautiful, man, because then it's like everything is fucking boring. So I think he recognized that while drugs perhaps might have played a role in opening people's minds to such a wildly experimental movie, in the end, drugs sometimes can have a destructive impact on a creative personality.
Right. I think more than anything, it helped find an initial audience that would sustain it enough that Warner's or MGM at the time. Warner Brothers now owns MGM, so they own the distribution rights and home video rights. But MGM was ready to yank it after about 30 days in the theater. They were like terrified that this
Which is still a pretty healthy long time. By today's standards, that's an eternity.
Exactly. At the time, that was nothing. They again, a film could easily stick around and spread to smaller parts of smaller towns for a year or more. So after 30 days, they were debating this, and they started getting word that these young, late teen, early 20s, these are really like my dad's generation and my mom's. And I think that's the thing. It started with that, but then it became something that reached more and more people as a result. Not specifically the drug culture people, but that generation.
And also, only people who smoke tons of weed are willing to sit around for like 6 hours debating what it all means. Like, I've had many of those stupid conversations in my time. But it sounds like people would go see this movie, trip their balls off, and go back to their dorm rooms or whatever, and just talk about science fiction and abstract concepts for a very long time. Because I feel like whether you want to talk about its depiction of artificial intelligence, like what we've created with HAL, or if you want to talk about human evolution, or if you want to talk about extraterrestrial intelligence, it's the best movie ever made on all those fronts.
Yeah.
It's like it tackles all these giant, big concepts. And I love how, like, in the middle of this movie about our first encounter with alien life, it basically just inserts like a 45-minute brilliant movie about AI run amok, and it's like, well, that could have just easily been a movie unto itself. That's a pretty goddamn good movie. It just happens to be like a movie within this much larger, grander movie.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because for the first hour, nothing really happens. It's sort of all setting the stage for the trip to Jupiter. I think it's around the 1 hour mark that we first are introduced to Bowman, and that's interesting because that breaks the rules of every kind of script writing class you would ever take, where the first character you see is the main character, the one you will follow through their journey and the one that you're going to connect to, relate to. You don't really relate to any of these characters. They're like very wooden, intentionally so, almost machine-like in their acting.
They're more machine-like than Hal.
Yeah.
Hal's got at least like some neurotic qualities, but the people are much more wooden. But I think one of my favorite scenes in the movie is when they're just hanging out at the Hilton on the space station and they're sitting around talking, and that one person is talking about how everything's classified, he's not going to divulge anything. It has the tone and the suspense and kind of eerie quality of the bathroom sequence in The Shining when Jack's talking to the former caretaker.
Right.
Like, wow, I was like, he's kind of already got that style in his back pocket for later use. And it's a really unsettling scene in a lot of ways when he just keeps refusing to speak any further on the particular topic, and everybody else is having this artificial politeness. But watching it this time, I was really struck by a scene where nothing appears to be happening, but in terms of tone and style, a lot seems to be going on beneath the surface.
It's true, and it's interesting how he is also very polite up until that final, more direct question where the other like Russian scientist says, may I ask you a question? And he's like, yes. And then he just sort of stares at him blankly, doesn't say anything for a few seconds, and just says, I don't think I can talk about this.
Yeah. And then he switches gears like, oh, but it's been great seeing everybody.
Yeah, exactly. I have to go get my breakfast.
Yeah. No, but it's so funny how all those scenes with him where he's falling asleep, like if we were to be on a ship traveling to and from space stations and the moon, we would just be overwhelmed. To be like Werner Herzog jumping into a live volcano. We'd just be so excited. But for him, it's so everyday and
it's
so
like
ordinary.
A business trip.
Yeah, absolutely. He's completely over it. But at the same time,
he's just earning frequent flyer miles.
Get these majestic shots to classical music. And I think this is the first time where people really realize that science could be awe-inspiring to the average observer. And I think it was really inspiring to a lot of people in the space program at the time. And I love all the technical expertise that they brought in, like when they could. And just, it seems like Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke wanted to have the physics and the space travel be as accurate as possible to their knowledge at the time, so that when it does get really wild at the end and starts breaking all the laws of physics, it's that much more profound. Like if you watch a movie like Guardians of the Galaxy, where it's just breaking the laws of physics every step of the way, it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact. But if you've seen this really grounded movie where things like explosive decompression are taken very seriously, when all of a sudden you start traveling at the speed of light and having your mind exploded and start meeting like the Sentinel and evolving into the space baby, like it makes that stuff seem so much more profound because it's jumping off of this incredibly gritty, realistic depiction of space.
Right. It's like a relatable depiction. Like we can look at it even today because it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
I mean, we thought it would have happened in 2001 at the time. That's a testament to how quickly the space race was pushing us towards getting to the moon and getting into space. Thanks to Kennedy and to the Soviet Union. Really, it was this race.
The competition breeds innovation.
Yeah, it does. and unfortunately, it kind of all ground to a screeching halt, sort of in the mid '70s. And if we would have continued the same innovation that we had up until that
Herzog
point.
would be on Mars at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
He's still ready to go.
I
He told
know.
Elon Musk he's ready to go, and Elon Musk kind of doesn't quite know whether to take him seriously.
I know. So I think it's interesting, but 50 years later now, we're still waiting for this future to come, but it still looks like what it could be. It feels grounded, as you said. It feels real, and
just like plucking the little pin
Yeah.
out of the air and putting it back in his
which
pocket.
I don't know if there's a great sort of documentary on the Blu-ray.
Oh, how it was like sliding on glass.
Yeah,
basically.
it was a piece of glass. They were
it's
turning in front of the camera.
It's such a simple special effect that requires no computers, no anything. And the reason it looks fucking real is because it's tangible.
It's a real pen. Yeah.
It's caught in camera.
Right.
And that makes it all the more
It
believable.
was just a little piece of double stick tape, which was a new invention at the time. It really hadn't been around.
But if they tried to
for very long.
superimpose it with if they tried to do it like optically with like
Right.
multiple film, that would have just been a train wreck.
Yeah, if you look at the end, there are like 5 people listed separately, separate cards for special photographic effects. I mean, that's a test that shows how much of what was shot required special photographic photography, and it was all in camera for the most part. It was all them shooting these doing tricks to make it look like something in space or something floating or whatever it might be. It's still, to me, and because it was shot in 70 millimeter, well, shot in 65 millimeter, projected in 70 millimeter, because of that, the negative is massive. Each frame is huge,
Like the
compared
size of
to
your palm of your
35.
hand,
Right.
yeah.
So therefore, as they have done multiple times over the years to restore it and re-release it, the information is there. Like there's the color, the detail is there in a way that even 35 would not have been able to.
Yeah, there's no grain at all. It's just pristine.
It's just because there was just so much information captured initially on those on those reels of 65 millimeter film. It makes the film look undated in that sense. It feels so fresh and new. And I'm sure they've, for the various Blu-ray and home video releases, they've done some cleanup work, repair work when necessary, which is why it would be fascinating to see an original 70 millimeter print projected, to see an unaltered, unrestored version. Because although they haven't done any George Lucas things to the film, they do make, as I said, sort of decisions to fix things or maybe adjust the color correction a little bit.
The only thing that seems dated to me at all, technically, is when they land on the moon to see the monolith, and it very clearly it almost looks like the set of Dr. No, how like when you see the excavation in the moon,
right.
It's like, oh, that's a soundstage, and so on and so forth.
Right.
Like that's the only point. And then when they're walking in, how the gravity seems a touch off from what we would expect. But when it comes to like just the opening shot of the moon and the Earth and the sun, or later on when he's flying through space and seeing all the planets and satellites around Jupiter, I think they're the best shots of things in space ever achieved by any filmmaker. And there's something weird about how they were done physically and like with actual real film and real tangible objects. It has a different quality than when you watch like Avengers Infinity War, a movie I absolutely love. But when I see them landing on Titan in Infinity War, like, oh, that's very painterly, beautiful digital drawings, but it doesn't feel like it's there. Whereas when I watch the opening shot of 2001, like, those are celestial bodies, and I can touch them when they're there. It just has a different quality to them.
It totally does. And yeah, I agree with you that there are a few shots or moments that are a little dated, but not to any extent that it would ruin the film for me.
Not in the slightest.
The most dated thing for me really is just some of the clothing they wear looks very 60s, the kind of types of suits they're wearing. That certainly, some styles like that change over time. But outside of that, I mean, everything on the Discovery, in my opinion,
and also fashions are cyclical. Who's to say that those fashions won't come back?
And with Mad Men, they sort of have started to come back.
Yeah.
So I think it was J. Crew that even did a Mad Men line of suits where everything kind of had those charcoal grays and kind of matched the look and feel of the early 60s. But I just think if anyone hasn't seen this movie, don't be afraid that it's 50 years old. It doesn't feel like it's 50 years old. And don't be upset if you don't quite get it the first time. Just think about it a while. Try to watch it again, maybe a year later.
Means you're dumb.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a little backlash against a film like this from people who don't get it or don't want
things to be spoon-fed to
them.
them.
And so therefore they're mad that so many people find such a meaning in it because they can't see.
These are the same people who don't like Twin Peaks because it's not spelled out for them. Like,
right.
Well, ambiguity is the home of the great artist.
Yeah.
And the fact that this movie is so visual and that, for me, raw, pure cinema is raw, pure visual storytelling. I love a great screenplay. I love a great book. I love narrative. I love the written word. But when you want the great cinematic experience, the really, truly great movies that you revisit again and again tend to rely on the visual storytelling, whether it's Lawrence of Arabia or whatever the case might be. Like Lawrence of Arabia's long sequences, granted, Robert Bolt's screenplay for it is stunning, but David Lean's visuals are on another level, and it's what really makes the movie soar in a lot of ways. But I feel like people have slowly, over 50 years of debate, kind of sort of zeroed in on what they think the spine of the story is. But I guess you can look for hidden nuance and hidden meanings in there. But I think no longer are people sitting around saying, what does it mean? Because I think a lot of people in general kind of broadly agree on basically alien life has left the Sentinel on the planet to kind of spark human evolution. I almost feel like Twitter today resembles everything before the Sentinel appears with the monkeys. We need a Sentinel to appear on Twitter and have everybody kind of be inspired by it and reach our next stage of evolution. Because I feel like social media very badly needs it.
Yeah.
And then we have yet another benchmark that lets the aliens know, oh, we've reached the moon, because it sends out that piercing, shrieking noise out to Jupiter. But
it's
then
it's like this beacon saying, "Here's your next stop."
Yeah,
they're
absolutely.
I think one critic called them
way.
sign, like on a road, like markers on a highway. You know, that each of these monoliths represents the next stop that humanity needs to take to sort of reach its full potential.
Yeah, and these shots of the monolith, I think, are my favorite shots of the movie. Maybe my favorite shot of the movie there's probably 1,000 great shots in this. Yeah. Is the shot of the monolith early on during the dawn of man when the camera's at its base looking up, and you see the sun peeking up behind it. It makes it seem so mysterious and so majestic and so powerful. And the fact that it does, like some people very condescendingly refer to it as a 1950s chocolate bar, but the simplicity and the elegance of it, I feel like Steve Jobs probably really liked the design of the monolith. He likes those like clean, simple, geometric patterns and that sort of thing.
Well, I think the point of it being that shape and that way was to say, this is clearly not natural. Something this perfectly, made, whether it was made or carved, who knows, but it couldn't happen by natural means. So you wouldn't just find this, as we send rovers to Mars and to search for, to take soil samples and things, like people are debating, like, what's that over there? That doesn't look like it's a rock. That looks like it's something from a intelligent, that might have been here a long time ago. But
Jones.
You can't really tell. JLA. Or the face on Mars, or is that just shadows? So, but if there was something like the monolith there, you would be like, okay, that's not just here by accident. That's not something that just happened. So it would be sort of proof of some type of intelligence creating that object, whether they are still around or not. Also, there's the question, is the object the intelligence? Is the object actually some type of intelligence?
Yeah, is it a tool
being?
Or is it a being? Because when you finally encounter it out in space, floating around by Jupiter, it takes on additional dimensions, whereas the first one seems like the catalyst to spark evolution, and the second one seems like a benchmark or an alarm system. This one that they encounter on Jupiter, because very clear at the very end of it, it is kind of hovering in front of him, is interacting, and it's almost like when he goes into it, it's almost like he and some sort of godlike entity are becoming one. It's just, once again, it's wildly open to interpretation when the camera pushes into it, but that is the point. I guess right before the camera pushes it in, we see him in that kind of fetal stage on the bed, and we get that beautiful shot in profile where it just seems so innocent, and we see like the birth of a new life form, and that's when the camera pushes in, the music swells, and we see the magical star baby returning to returning to Earth, which I feel like maybe is the best ending of any movie ever made in terms of exploring infinite possibilities. And from that point on, if your imagination isn't just going completely insane, then you have a shortage of creativity.
Well, and I think that's that makes the film so amazing, is that anyone can take that ending and interpret it how they want. Some people see it as God. Some people see this as an analogy for, what comes next after the afterlife. Others will go to the book, which again came out afterwards, where Arthur C. Clarke was a little more. He spells it out a little more. And I think if people want something like that, just read the book you'll get it.
If you're craving answers, the answers are there.
And it may not be, though, the same answers and they both have admitted this, both Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke both have said that, or Arthur C. Clarke has said that his book may not be what Kubrick was intending you to take away.
Because they were discovering and exploring
Exactly.
as they went. When they started making the movie, at one point they thought the ending might just be finding the monolith or the Sentinel on the moon.
Right.
Like that was going to be the ending of the movie.
Right.
Like, wow, we
Like,
found
that's
the
the
evidence.
big reveal.
That's
Yeah.
the big reveal.
Yeah.
And eventually it became the beginning.
Right.
It just shows, I love the fact that it wasn't like they had this perfectly formed idea in their head of what the movie should be. That Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick were exploring and discovering and imagining as they went. And it just seems like this really genuine, pure collaboration of two giants of their craft who come from totally different backgrounds. And I read this great bit where Kubrick was asking Arthur C. Clarke for ideas on science fiction movies to watch as part of his research and preparation. And Arthur C. Clarke told him to watch Things to Come, which is from like 1938 or 1939. And Kubrick said that he would never watch another movie again recommended by Arthur C. Clarke after seeing Things to Come. So they weren't necessarily in lockstep.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think that sometimes when you get your best creative results is when you have two very strong storytellers coming at from completely different perspectives.
And this reinforces the fact that they were collaborating, but also sort of discovering the film as they were making it. It reinforces what I sort of learned working with Matthew Modine on his Full Metal Jacket diary project, because that was his diary that he kept while making that film. And it's all about the fact that Kubrick didn't know the ending. He was constantly asking his actors, what do you think should happen to your character? What do you think should be the ending?
Same with Barry Lyndon. He didn't have an ending until really Leon Vitali kind of helped give him open up that doorway.
Exactly. So it's just so interesting. It's somebody that people consider to be such a sort of perfectionist, that he kind of everything's like they think that he has it all figured out in advance in his head, and it's just like more like a Hitchcock, where he goes in, he shoots exactly what he knows he wants to be in the film, nothing more, and then that way the editors, the studio can't take anything out. They can't, because they have nothing to work with else to work with. I think Kubrick was the opposite. He was like just shooting and shooting and shooting and just waiting for something to kind of spark an idea as to where the film needed to go. And he was constantly rewriting and adding things, and like Leon's character being
growing as the film went on.
Yeah, it was a smaller role, and then he liked him so much that he wrote new scenes for him.
But to have that latitude is so rare, because you only get that kind of latitude if you have a reputation as a genius,
right,
but B, have a reputation of keeping your costs down and delivering commercially viable films. Because Kubrick, as big and as long, like, you know, people always say, "Oh, I signed up for 9 months and I came home 4 years later," and it's like, "Oh my fucking god!"
Yeah.
But he was a master at keeping his costs down, not having an unnecessary crew lying around.
Yeah.
They worked hard
right.
to keep their costs down, and so he was a master of keeping people at bay because he wanted that latitude, he wanted that control. And with 2001, it was one of the things where, after Dr. Strangelove, MGM was kind of prepared to give him a little bit of rope to hang himself with. But from pretty much that point on, I mean, Barry Lyndon underperformed, but John Calley, who he worked with many times, it was either you're going to do it his way or you weren't going to make a Stanley Kubrick movie.
Right. And I think this movie, 2001, might be the only film where he really did run out of money, because at a certain point, because this was just compared to everything else that he had made.
There were going to be aliens in the movie.
There were. They were trying to figure out a way to make them represented in a sort of physical form, because that really was sort of the idea of the ending, was that he was in, that Bowman had sort of been taken into almost like a zoo, like where they created this hotel room that he had once stayed in.
He would feel comfortable.
Where he would feel comfortable, like they said, if you were in a, if you have an animal in a zoo, you put a tree branch in there, and you put some grass in there. Oh, you'll feel more at home now, right?
Absolutely.
Even though you're in prison for the rest of your life. So, and as he was, he was apparently there as he turned into an old man, and then one of the best shots in the movie, he sees the monolith the final time, which is, people forget that's the fourth and final time you see the monolith is in that hotel room. He's on his deathbed laying there, and he raises his hand slowly and points to the monolith, and that's
it's almost like what's that old painting from the Sistine Chapel by
with the apple, not the fingers touching.
It was Adam and God touching, but it's almost like that moment.
Exactly. I'm blanking on I know what you're talking about, but and then that's when it cuts to the Star Child and the rebirth, of life. And so I think there's a couple possibilities here. I think one is that he was being observed, but we are sort of as the audience, we're the aliens observing him. That's one way to look at it. Another way is just that we're not the aliens don't have a physical form in the way that we as humans would be able to see them, that they are in some other sort of plane of existence, pure energy, something of that nature. So they're sort of observing Bowman live and eat and grow and age and become reborn, but also sort of revealing to him the sort of next step in evolution.
Yeah, but it's almost like a snake shedding its skin. He needs to age out before this next step can take place.
Exactly. So they have to. Yeah, he's got to run out the clock, so to speak. And so that then of course gets more explained in the book, and even more so in the sequel, 2010. The Year We Make Contact, which again was made into a film with John Lithgow, Roy Scheider. It's a good film. It's not a bad movie. It's just much more for the masses in the sense that it's just you're being spoon-fed.
That's the irony of 2001. 2001 ended up being a movie for the masses.
Did, yeah.
It's on the surface should not be. This movie should have been an abysmal failure in so many ways. The fact that it became a crowd pleaser is one of those rare moments in film history where just a little miracle occurred.
Yeah.
Where the filmmaker got to make the movie he wanted to make. It was a masterpiece, and people loved it. It so rarely happens.
But I do think it took time, and I think it's a textbook case of word of mouth making a film successful. Not the marketing campaign, not the critics. It was word of mouth. It was people. Maybe they were going first high, maybe not, but they were telling their friends, "You got to see this movie, man."
I don't know if I'd want to watch it high. I'd want to watch it with like an espresso.
You don't want to miss anything.
Well, also it's one of the things where it's like it ain't fast. Like I remember eating a pop brownie out in LA when I went and saw Guardians of the Galaxy for like the fourth or fifth time, and it was the perfect way to experience it.
For the fourth time,
I was insanely fucked up. And having the time of my life, but I was so fucked up. I was like, "Oh my god, I hope this movie plays for a while because I need to time to sober up and kind of collect myself and that sort of thing." But 2001, I want to be razor sharp. I want to be completely clear when I'm watching it. It's just a different kind of experience. But I'm just glancing down my notes now and going back to the whole collaboration between Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke. I think a lot of times people think that only now with digital filmmaking are we capable of basically showing anything we want on screen, but Kubrick apparently said to Arthur C. Clarke, "If you can describe it, I can film it," which I think is a really interesting creative challenge because obviously on the page there's no budgets, there's no schedules, there's no anything. You just write whatever the hell you want. But Kubrick's like, "Fuck you, write it, and I'll find a way to put it on screen."
But what arrogance too! I mean, what balls to be like, "I got this, man. You don't worry about it. Just tell me what you want to what the story is, what you need to tell the story. I'll worry about filming it." It's kind of like just shows you what confidence he had, not just in his abilities, but in also the people he collaborated with, because he did collaborate. I mean, he worked in this film with the great Jeffrey Unsworth, who did like Superman, went on to do films like Superman, which is a beautifully shot film. And many other films, of course. It was edited by Ray Lovejoy, who went on to do Batman in 1989, Tim Burton Batman. These are films that I saw before 2001. Yeah. So it was kind of cool for me to see that they had worked on this amazing film earlier in their career. But he put together Douglas Trumbull was one of the key visual effects wizards that worked on this film.
Who very famously alienated Jodorowsky when he was trying to prepare Dune. He went to some meeting and he was like, he thought he was way too important.
Well, after you make 2001, something happens to your career and yourself. It's, I don't know. But it's...
also, there's nothing in Kubrick's career prior to this that makes you think he has this in his DNA. It's like, granted, Spartacus had enormous scope.
Right.
But the movies, if you look at Lolita and Dr. Strangelove, there's nothing in either of those movies that makes you think,
smaller films.
Oh, let's do the most visionary, beautiful poem, symphonic poem about science fiction ever made. I like this movie has much more in common with music than it does with fiction.
Yeah, it's almost a silent film. I think some critics have stated that about the movie, that in a way, as you watch it, there's very little dialogue, and most of the dialogue, if you wanted to do it, could have been done with title cards in between, like an old silent film, and it would have played exactly the same because there's so little in the way of actual dialogue.
Hal's dialogue, I just love and adore. Maybe the funniest moment in the entire career of Kubrick is when Hal says, I know I've made some very bad decisions lately. I mean, for a movie that's so serious in its purpose and so grand in its ambitions, to have that weird little bit of subtle humor thrown in after he's just been murdering the crew. I mean, just
he's essentially at that point starting to plead for his life, his quote unquote life.
I'm afraid.
Yeah,
it's so eerie.
And it's been described almost like rape, the way that Bowman is like slowly pulling out his memory banks or his information, and he's getting weaker, kind of softer and quieter, and I'm fading. I think I'm going. I feel myself. My mind going. I feel myself.
And then he talks about the song they learned. He's like, sing it for me, Hal.
Yeah.
And it's creepy and distant. Just how the way he's.
And that's the first time he acknowledges Hal.
Yeah.
Is after he's probably thinking, I got to keep working. Might as well hear some music.
Yeah. Or just at this point, like I'm just going to distract him. There's no way Hal can try and kill me or murder me.
Right.
One of my favorite moments of the movie is when we don't quite see how Hal kills the other astronaut, but we get this great bit where the camera, we get like 3 or 4 shots in a row pushing in on Hal. Yeah. And then we just see the reaction, the aftermath of this guy flying off into space. You're like, whoa, what the hell did Hal do? But it shows that Hal is capable. He's got limited functionality, but goddamn, is he Machiavellian in his tactics within his limited range of options.
Right. And this certainly, as far as I am aware of, is probably one of the first cases where a film really tackled the concept of, artificial intelligence becoming more powerful than man. Obviously, it inspired countless other filmmakers and science fiction stories that tackled this. I mean, everything from Terminator to whatever, you name it, TV shows. But this was probably ground zero for most of those modern, at least from the last 50 years. This film probably inspired more. I mean, I think Lucas and Spielberg.
Just a dot. It's a red dot.
Yeah.
And he has so much malignance and power and presence.
I mean, I think this film probably inspired more science fiction than any other film. I mean, I know that
some describe it as a battle cry for a generation.
Yeah.
A generation of aspiring filmmakers, they saw this, and it's much like Blade Runner for the 80s or Citizen Kane for the early 40s. There are certain movies that come along where an impressionable young generation sees it, their lives are transformed, and it breeds the next generation of filmmakers.
Yeah. Everyone from Christopher Nolan, who said he saw this when he was 8 years old in 70 millimeter, and he just knew at that point he wanted to make movies. Lucas and Spielberg both said that Star Wars and Close Encounters and even E.T. probably never would have been made if they hadn't seen this movie. It basically opened their minds to the possibilities. Again, if you look at what science fiction was prior to this, you didn't even imagine this was possible to make such a serious and realistic looking film that told a story of such magnitude and scale. So even if they had their ideas for Close Encounters, they probably didn't think, or Star Wars, they probably didn't think it was possible to put it on screen in a believable way.
It was the world of fiction. Because if you think about it in the silent era, there's so few science fiction movies made. There's like Voyage to the Moon by Georges Méliès, and of course you got Metropolis. But it's a genre with very few entries until the Atomic Age, and then of course you get a lot of giant insect movies and a lot of alien movies. But really, it was the home of short stories and fiction in the 20s and 30s. And, of course, obviously, you have
pulp magazines.
You got H.G. Wells and guys like that writing great science fiction in the late 1800s and early 20th century. But prior to 2001, there's just not a lot of science fiction to choose from. And then post-2001, you got Star Wars, you got Alien, you got Blade Runner. It opens the door to all these other movies.
And I think even the Star Trek, the motion picture, took a cue. I mean, the opening scenes where you see the Enterprise for the first time, I think they totally decided to do... pull a Kubrick and just take their time with Jerry Goldsmith's score.
Just the grandeur of V'ger. The fact that V'ger is so enormous and so difficult to grasp and fully understand, and it's so complex, I think it very clearly is taking a page from 2001's book, where it's like, it's not Khan with his man boobs, speaking like...
It was going for more of the mystery and the awe-inspiring approach versus the action thriller that Khan was.
V'ger's more of a concept than an actual character.
Yeah. And it's more about the next step in our evolution as human beings, like versus a space adventure or action movie, which many of the subsequent films, Star Trek films, were.
Can you? What science fiction movies since then do you feel like have had, whether they were successful or not, have had a similar level of ambition?
Since 2001?
Yeah.
Well, obviously, I think there are a couple benchmarks. I think there are 3 sci-fi benchmarks. I think Metropolis was the first. in 1927, Fritz Lang, it just created a world that had never been seen before, a futuristic world. Then you have, I would jump all the way to 2001, and then probably the next would be Blade Runner in terms of sort of the visual
and
influences.
Once again, some ambiguity.
And a fair amount of ambiguity, at least at the time. I mean, he had like 5 cuts, so changes, things were added, unicorn dreams, so, but in recent years, I can't think of a film that.
I think Nolan was striving for it with Interstellar,
very much.
did not necessarily. I think he fell short of the mark.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things that Interstellar does well.
To be his, because he's been compared so often to Kubrick, I think that was to be his 2001, but it didn't quite hit the mark. Although, who knows, 50 years from now, maybe we'll look at that movie in a whole different light. I liked it. I didn't love it.
Yeah.
That movie.
I felt the same way. I saw it once in the theater in 70 millimeter here in New York, and I was like, wow, that was an incredible experience. But I've never felt compelled to revisit it.
Yeah. Nolan, again, is for me, I think he's an extremely talented visual and technical filmmaker, but I often find that I don't connect with the characters very well.
I think he wants to be Kubrick when in actuality he's probably something closer to Spielberg. Like,
right.
It's just a different style of filmmaking.
Exactly.
And I defy anybody to watch The Dark Knight and not have the best time of their lives. Like The Dark Knight is such an extraordinary experience, but it's very different from what Kubrick was able to achieve. He made very few movies, but each movie was totally different from what came before. He never covered the same ground twice.
Yeah, essentially every film he made was a new genre, and I think that's actually interesting, or sort of like a mashup of different genres. Like Dr. Strangelove is a war movie, but a comedy war movie.
Yeah, and it's one of a kind.
Spartacus is a war movie, but from ancient times versus Paths of Glory. So he's done different types of war movies that sort of tackle them in a different
like Paths of Glory, Spartacus, Dr. Strangelove, and Barry Lyndon, and Full Metal Jacket. Like war was very interesting to him. History was very interesting to him. But all 5 of those movies are wildly different.
A completely different place. Whereas other directors who make war movies are just kind of making standard war movies. They're telling a story about a war. Whereas he was always not really telling it didn't matter what the setting was. He was always trying to say something different about war, or about the people who fight in war, or about why we fight, or things like that.
I think the only thing that his war movies have in common is a similar level of craftsmanship.
Yeah.
If you watch Barry Lyndon and you watch Full Metal Jacket, you wouldn't immediately assume these are made by the same filmmaker, but they have a similar level of craftsmanship. And I think going back to 2001, the craftsmanship is so exquisite and the sound design is so precise. It's what makes the movie have such longevity. Like just little things when the astronaut's about to do the explosive decompression to get back into the ship from his little pod, and all these alarm bells are going off, and it's this big swelling crescendo. But when he pops through, total silence.
Yeah.
He hits the wall, he bounces back, hits the other wall, and that's a little miracle of sound design, and it's so subtle and so effective. And like you don't need to go back and do a remaster, or you don't need to go back and like pull a George Lucas and try to change all your special effects, because it's perfect how it is.
Yeah. Well, another thing that I always notice when I watch this movie, because as we grow as a society, our technology continues to advance. So every time I look at it, I see something more that he predicted, or that they predicted, Clark and Kubrick, technologically speaking, especially in the first sort of half of the film. It's just remarkable how many things on screen actually came to fruition, and it was just imagination at the time.
Remember at the beginning of Steve Jobs, and they had the interview with Arthur C. Clarke, and he's basically predicting what's going to happen with the computer and social media, and he predicts it like in like the early 60s. Like, what the fuck?
Right.
Like, he was just an insanely
These people
clever,
were on,
bright
like,
individual.
Another plane of existence in their own right. I mean, what's that line when Close Encounters at the end where they talk about Einstein? He was probably one of them. Like maybe these guys were they're plants from some other civilization, because they were operating on another level.
Visionaries.
Yeah, and the fact that they had sort of tablet type iPad computers that they were watching the BBC broadcast from on the Discovery, the video phones where they talk, where he talks to his daughter on Earth, played by Vivian Kubrick, Stanley's daughter. And I mean, there's countless.
I love
innovations.
For her present, she wants a telephone. He's like, telephone? We have plenty of telephones.
Yeah, exactly. She wants a Bush baby, whatever that is.
Oh, it's funny thinking of these visionaries. I don't know why it suddenly popped in my head, but there's
Yeah.
when I was reading The Making of 2001, there's this great story about people sitting like scientists in the future, spending years and years developing the ultimate supercomputer, and they sit around for days and days debating what should be the first question that we ask of this supercomputer, and finally they say, "Is there a God?" And the computer just responds, "There is now." But it reminds me of Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke. Like these guys in their fields, they were basically godlike in their abilities.
Yeah, and it's just it's remarkable what sort of foresight they had. But yeah, I mean, I look at like I said, I was rewatching it this time, and I was catching more and more things. I mean, everything from the sets that they constructed to create. That were spinning on gimbals. Like they just went so much farther than I feel like any other director or studio would have permitted.
And everything's practical as opposed to cool. Like you look at the Millennium Falcon, you're like, all right, all that stuff that's on the surface of it probably doesn't have a practical purpose, but it looks cool. That's why we love the Millennium Falcon. That's why people started crying when they saw the first teaser for Force Awakens. Like, it's back! I love it! I love that ship! But the ships in 2001 look like they're based on actual physics and actual engineering.
Yeah. One thing I never realized until this viewing was that sort of cut early in the film from the bone thrown to the air, which cuts forward to 2001.
Yeah, it's a weapon.
It's actually like a nuclear weapon in space.
Yeah, you always think it's like a ship or a space station.
Or a satellite
but
or
I was
something.
watching one of the documentaries. It was intended to be a space-age weapon.
Right, which I think they would have had originally narration of some kind or something that was going to explain that.
A voiceover would have murdered
Oh,
this
it would have
movie.
been horrible, yeah. But it's so much better that it wasn't explained. It becomes an object in space, but the connection can still be made that it's a tool, the bone was a tool, and that's a modern day tool in space. Doesn't mean that it has to be a weapon. Weapons are tools too. They just have their job or their purpose is to destroy things versus create things. So it didn't need to be spelled out.
Yeah, probably the most famous jump cut in movie history. Where it cuts forward like a couple million years. But just another glance at my notes, I saw this great quote from a guy, I think his name is JBS Haldane, but this is one of the lines that was basically helped inspire their approach to the movie, where he said, "The universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine." But I feel like this is one of those movies that help people learn how to imagine. I think when you read a really riveting science fiction novel, like Frank Herbert's Dune, it opens up your imagination. It educates your imagination. It enriches your palette. It gives you the tools for imagining these fully fleshed out worlds. And I feel like when it comes to visual poetry, 2001 teaches us as viewers to expect more from our filmmakers, to aim our sights higher.
Right. Yeah, I'm just looking at my notes, and one thing I also caught was when they're traveling to the moon from the space station, the little view screens, they're watching like a karate tournament. Remember? It's such a weird moment.
It's like a YouTube video, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But what I did catch this time is those screens were in the 16:9 ratio, which at the time was like
all TVs
40
were 4:3.
years away from, everything was 4:3. So did they anticipate that we would have widescreen televisions because that's what was in theaters? Or it's just, again, a very subtle but interesting prediction that they made. Also, I love the 10 steps to pee chart. I wish I could read every step. I wish I could get like the negative, because I tried like zooming in on the screen. You can't really make it out. But I always thought it would be interesting to, because they wrote something for those 10 steps. So
absolutely.
Maybe it's somewhere
it's
online.
Not just scribble scrabble.
Yeah.
Well, quick question: have you ever done this experiment? And this is something I learned in college. It was a buddy of mine who was in my fraternity 2 years below me, and when he joined, he knew I was a movie freak. He was talking about 2001 and how it was his favorite movie. But he started talking about the Pink Floyd album Metal, specifically the final track, Echoes. And what I didn't know at the time is that Echoes, basically, it's like a very experimental piece of music that perfectly coincides. And according to Dinos, I haven't even bothered looking this up in the 20-year interim since. It was designed to be an alternative soundtrack from the moment, I guess, what's the title card, where after he gets the message about how what the true nature of their mission is, and this is like to Jupiter and Beyond, or what is it? What is it?
Jupiter and Beyond the Infinite.
Jupiter and Beyond the Infinite. If you start the song Echoes, which is 23 minutes and 32 seconds long, if you start Echoes at the right moment, right where it says that, it will actually perfectly draw to a close right as the Space Baby, where I think it's the final, the first title card is like directed, produced, and like conceived by Stanley Kubrick or something like that.
It actually says something weird like this movie was directed by. Like he writes that out in a very odd way.
Very grandiose.
Yeah.
But in college, I can't tell you how much fun we had several times. And this is like, I might disagree with Kubrick a little bit because sometimes it is fun to take drugs. We would take a lot of drugs. And we would put in Echoes from the album Metal, and we would play that last bit. And we'd figured out, we'd got it down to a science. It is extraordinary to have this experience. But also, there's no dialogue that whole time, so having Pink Floyd provide it, it doesn't have a negative impact on the movie.
And there's not even a great deal of music until the very end, Star Baby cue.
Yeah, it's just like the
it's like a lot of tones and it's like
all those weird sounds.
Exactly, which are kind of haunting in their own right.
They're terrifying.
But I'm sure, and now I'm going to have to look this up after. I'm sure it's on YouTube. I'm sure someone has taken that scene and married it to that track, and it's available to watch.
Yeah.
So I'll check it out. I definitely will.
I know you're not necessarily the world's biggest like hallucinogenic drug fan, but I promise you'll have a good time even if you're totally sober.
Yeah, I'll check it out. One thing that I sort of pulled out from my reading and research was an excerpt from one of Kubrick's interviews, which just to me spells out. This is one of the times that I think he kind of let the cat out of the bag about what he thinks the meaning of the film is, but also it just shows in the way he talks. He's again operating on another level. So I'll just read this. It's not very long. Can you imagine the evolutionary development that much older life forms have taken? He's referring to, alien beings or from another part of the universe. They may have progressed from biological species, which are fragile shells for the mind at best, into immortal machine entities, and then, over innumerable eons, they could emerge from the chrysalis of matter, transformed into beings of pure energy and spirit. Their potentialities would be limitless, and their intelligence ungraspable by humans. Like, that's just like, this is just out off the cuff, like in a spoken interview. That's how he talks. Like, that's really describing, I think, what he thinks the journey that man is taking and will be going into.
Yeah, it's our first step in shuffling off the husk of our flesh.
Right.
But it's the first step of many to come.
Yeah, exactly. So I think he did, even though he repeatedly refused to kind of answer the question outright, I think he gave those clues from time to time when talking more generally about the concepts. He was a big believer in the fact that we're not alone in this universe. He did the math, and how many billions of stars and potential planets.
Also, our star isn't even necessarily that exceptional of a star.
No,
it's rather kind of humdrum,
right?
As much as we might like it,
and very young in comparison to many of the stars in the visible universe. So it's I think. He just was operating on another level.
He is teach your children chess at a young age. I think, honestly, that had probably the most lasting influence on Stanley Kubrick as a person was his obsession with playing chess as a young man, hanging out in my old neighborhood at McDougal and 4th Street, hustling chess games. It just sharpens your intellect. It's like going to a martial arts class every day. It's going to hone and train your body. He was honing and training his mind from an early age. And I think one of our failures of our education system is always teaching us certain facts that may or may not be relevant a few years from now,
right,
as opposed to teaching you how to think. And I think Kubrick early on was teaching himself how to think. He was largely self-educated, voracious reader, every single year of his life to the bitter end, just constantly consuming these enormously large, challenging books. Obviously, was an enormous, voracious consumer of very challenging artistic films.
And while he was playing chess in New York City, he was going around the city and photographing it with a Rolleiflex.
Learning his trade.
Learning how to make beautiful compositions of everyday life. And those photographs are actually on display right now at the Museum of New York City. There's a Kubrick exhibition where there's about 120 plus original prints.
He had an incredible eye early on.
Yeah.
And he made those short films like Day of the Fight and things like that.
Yep.
I mean, from a very early age, you can tell there's a vision at work.
Exactly. Yeah, and you can look at those pictures, those photographs that he shot, again, just of like hot dog vendors or people asleep on the subway. They just had his same compositional eye. Even though he worked with incredible cinematographers, he was very much finding his shot on the set. As they talk about in the Filmworker documentary, he had his little viewfinder, and he was always just walking around looking for the shot.
Also, pictures on the set. It's not like he's off in Video Village. He's up there.
Oh, yeah.
With his eye, basically, he's looking through the camera. He's not content to let other people do the work for him.
Right.
And I think sometimes, even though he had great cinematographers, they were perhaps a little bit annoyed that he was doing so much of their job for them. But
that he could.
But he knew what he wanted.
Some DPs like the fact that they know more about that side of the business than the director. The director might know acting and direction and all of that, but they don't know all about the lenses.
That was the original division of labor. Like in the earliest days of the silent era, early 1900s, late 1800s, you would have somebody who would work with the actors, and that eventually became the director, and you'd have somebody who would handle the shooting of the film, and they became the director of photography. But it was over time, as certain mad geniuses started to emerge, that those lines became increasingly blurry.
Right, and because what oftentimes would happen is an entry point for directing would be being a cinematographer. You would work your way up kind of through the system, working as an assistant, and then for the DP and maybe a focus puller. Then you would get your first DP job working as.
Or if you're David Lean, you'd come in from the opposite angle, from editing,
or editing. Yeah, exactly. Which many argue is one of the most important parts of the filmmaking process, because it's Sidney Pollack said it was every movie he made was made in the editing room. So
where the magic happens.
It's where it really.
But then you have guys
together.
like John Cassavetes who come at it just from the acting. I always find it interesting seeing where these directors come from, whether they come from the written word. If they're a great screenwriter, like say they're Robert Towne and they want to make the jump to directing.
Right.
Or I feel like that's Tarantino, was very much like a writer first, selling screenplays before he made the jump to being a director. Tarantino wasn't much of an actor. He had acted, but he wasn't much of an actor. But it's interesting seeing what kind of filmmakers they become given the foundation of where they come from.
Right. And Kubrick was just a rare person where he could sort of do everything.
Except for act,
which I don't think he ever attempted. He actually hated
Leon Vitali directed him in his one bit of acting.
Right. He hated being in front of the camera. He did not want to be put in front of the camera. And I think you're referring to the award in the mid-90s.
In 1998, he accepted the award for the DGA, Lifetime Achievement Award. And Leon Vitali got to direct the master.
It was like the worst, most unrehearsed, it's wooden. It's just.
He had some stupid idea where he wanted to step backwards out of frame, and Leon's like, "No, just let me fade to black over. It's fine." But he was just painfully awkward and painfully shy. But you say in person though, he could, when he wanted to be, could be very, very warm and hospitable.
A lot of people say that. Obviously, I've worked with Matthew Modine, so I know and have heard a lot of stories through him. I also got to meet Leon. About a decade ago. I have a sort of a funny story. I was working for Apple at the time, and every year there was a big convention in Las Vegas called NAB, the National Association of Broadcasters, where everybody in the film industry would kind of come to Vegas, talk about the latest tools of the trade,
and get
cameras,
lap dances.
Yeah, cinema, Steadicam rigs and editing software, and everyone. It's like a big convention. Apple that year was unveiling something really big. It was this new Final Cut Studio software package. So I was there, and I invited Matthew, who I had previously met working with him on his book launch a few years earlier. I invited him to come out and watch the big keynote address and come, just enjoy the big event. And he, in turn, invited Leon Vitali and Vivian Kubrick to come as well. So I ended up having this we all attended the event, and then we all sort of hung out for 2 days in Vegas, the four of us. It was like the very surreal.
It's a cool company to hang out with.
It was like a lot of stories being told, but just they're all just goofing off. We played some blackjack, went out to dinner, just kind of wandered around the strip. It was just like a very strange moment, but I'm just thinking, so I'm with Matthew Modine, Stanley Kubrick's daughter, and Leon Vitali. They worked you can't get closer to the genius of Stanley
Part
Kubrick
of the inner circle.
than I am right now. For that little moment in time. I over the years have spoken to Leon and Vivian at different times on the phone, but haven't seen them in person since that time. And they're living.
They're all we have left of Kubrick in
exactly.
terms of part of his inner circle. I mean, Jack Nicholson's still alive, and Ryan O'Neal's still alive.
Right.
Some of his stars are still alive, but there are not that many people left who can tell you what it was like to work and star.
Right.
Tom Cruise is obviously in that mix, but there's a very short list.
It's a short list, and I think Vivian and Leon were probably the closest of the two, next to Kubrick's wife. I mean, that would be the only other person. But and then there's Jan Harlan, who is his brother-in-law, but he was kind of more handling the business side of things. Yep. He wasn't sort of with him day to day, where Leon and Vivian was obviously a child during 2001. That's why she's the little girl on the video phone. But as she got older, she started to want to learn more about filmmaking, and of course went on to work with Leon and her dad.
Well, she made the documentary about The Shining while they're shooting it.
Exactly. And she was doing the same thing during Full Metal Jacket as well, but it never sort of came together. Like, she shot out hundreds of hours of behind-the-scenes footage, but there's a lot of issues with that. I don't know the whole story behind it, but the sound was lost for one thing, and then I think there's some rights issues with like who really owns the footage, because she was being paid by Warner Brothers to actually film it. So, and she didn't want to, but I think she had some sort of creative control over it. So sort of there's a little bit of perhaps tug of war about who, if something were to be done with it, who would have the control over it.
Gotcha.
I think that might be one of the issues, but regardless, just those people had a front row seat to the
Stanley Kubrick show for a long time. The closest I came to meeting Leon Vitali was at New York Film Festival. They're showing the Filmworker. I was there with Rob Cotto, who's been on the podcast a few times. But just by chance, the filmmakers and Leon sat down directly behind us. And I was like, well, shit. I was like, I got to have some sort of interaction of some kind. So when the movie ended, I just turned around and gave them these two big thumbs up. I was like, yeah! And that was the extent of my interaction with Leon. So it was dark. I don't even know if you really even saw me.
If you can get a ticket still, he'll be at the Filmworker screenings this Friday and Saturday night. I know you've seen it 2 times now, so you may not want to watch it again. But he has flown out from Los Angeles to attend these 2 screenings at the Metrograph Theater with the director Tony Zira, and Leon is getting up there. I think he's over 70 now, and I think he's
70 going on 170.
Yeah, he's got some health issues. So
a lot of tea, booze, and cigarettes of the years. But maybe this is the perfect pivot point to talk about Filmworker. All right, well, we're back. We're going to be shifting gears a little bit now to Filmworker, which we've been kind of tap dancing around the edges of it. But for people out there who are not aware of Filmworker or its topic or this person, Leon Vitali, that we keep referring to, give people the gist of what the film's about and just who Leon Vitali was and what he represented to Kubrick's inner circle.
Sure, yeah. So Leon Vitali was an actor, a working actor in England, a British actor in the 60s, early 70s. And he was someone that wanted to be an actor, loved acting, and when he saw 2001 and then later A Clockwork Orange, he was just mesmerized by the filmmaking and Kubrick in general. And I think he said to his friend, it's in the documentary, I want to work for this man. And somehow he got the opportunity to do that in Kubrick's next film, Barry Lyndon, where he was cast as Lord Bullington. And this was a role, as we mentioned, that was a smallish role in the beginning, but sort of evolved over time. Kubrick really liked Leon and sort of began writing additional scenes for his character, and to the point where he's,
the ending would be impossible without him.
He's integral. He's the one that brings Barry Lyndon down, basically, and it's one of the most important parts of the film in many respects.
And does that differ from the Thackeray novel?
I'm not exactly sure. I haven't read that novel, so I don't know. I think, again, he was searching, like all his other films, always searching for an ending, so which leads me to believe that he wasn't following the novel as a blueprint in any way. I think he was inspired by it.
The Shining, he has a different ending.
Yeah.
Clockwork Orange, he has a different ending.
I think he
makes a lot of modifications to the novels.
And even Full Metal Jacket was based upon the Short Timers.
Yeah, Lolita is based on a book. Yeah. I mean, a lot of books had the source material for his films.
But I think he used them more as sort of inspiration, as a starting point to tell his version of that story or that period of time. So anyway, after they worked together, Leon basically went on he wanted to learn more about Kubrick's process. So he decided that if he had a chance, he would do anything to be with Kubrick, to learn about editing, to learn about whatever he could learn about the filmmaking process. He didn't know anything about it. It was the first time that he was kind of really working with him on Barry Lyndon, that he was interested in what went into making the movie. The fact that Kubrick was lighting that film entirely through candles and natural light, things that were never, I mean, that's incredibly difficult, but Kubrick wanted to make it look a certain way. So Leon was fascinated by this and eventually began volunteering on other films in the editing room and had the opportunity to...
It was like some Frankenstein movie where he said, like, you don't have to pay me, but I just want to assist in the editing room, the cutting room.
Exactly.
He was a Brit.
One of the stars of the film, and he basically told the filmmakers, I would love to just do whatever I can do. I'll get coffee for you guys.
I'll be a scrub. I'll be a PA, even though I just starred in the movie.
He was so inspired by working on Barry Lyndon as an actor to learn about the behind-the-scenes aspects of how a film is produced and edited and released, and the whole process. And it's because there's marketing, there's all of it. He was fascinated with the whole process in general. So he then somehow got an opportunity to speak with Kubrick, and Kubrick said, if you want to work with me, I would love for you to go to America and help me find a young actor to play the boy in The Shining.
Was it Danny Torrance?
Danny Torrance, yeah. And Leon, of course, said, of course, I'll go to America for you and help you find an actor. So that kind of began a nearly 25-year working relationship up until Kubrick's death, where he basically worked at Kubrick's side on everything and anything you can think of. He was a jack of all trades, and he learned as he went along from Kubrick and from other people around him.
Like color correcting and marketing and film preservation and running lines. And just the amount of shit that got dumped in his lap over that 25-year period. He essentially coached
R. Lee Ermey on the role of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman in Full Metal Jacket. He was not an actor. He was brought on as the technical advisor. And when they saw what an incredible job he did running lines with the extras, they were like, this is our guy.
Yeah.
And they decided to,
And he's the first to admit that without Leon's help, the part would not have either been his or half of what it became.
Right. So Leon basically, as an actor, was able to sort of teach him how to act, but also sort of work with him to develop a character and to develop lines and everything from scratch.
Because all that profanity spewing out of his mouth was not in the script.
No, it was developed from that point. Once the decision was made to bring him on board, they essentially were throwing out everything, including the original actor, Tim Colseri, who was cast to play the role.
This is what the film description of the blood and halitosis and coffee and cigarette mixture that was in Lee Ermey's mouth. Just, he said, when they were like recoiling from him screaming at them, it wasn't acting. Like his breath was just pure death. But like Leon Vitali, he found the little twin girls in The Shining. There's so many ingredients to what we love and adore about Stanley Kubrick's movies, where Leon was playing an active, creative role in helping flesh those details out.
And that's essentially what this new film, Filmworker, is about. It's an interesting title because I've never really heard the term filmworker.
Yeah, it's because a filmmaker.
Right, because a filmmaker is often associated with a director or a producer, somebody at sort of a top-level role. And, below those, you have titles: editor, cinematographer, DP,
juicers,
first
gaffers,
assistant director, first AD. But he wasn't one thing. He was a little of everything. So as a result, I think the term filmworker is a really great title for this movie because that's what he did. He worked on films.
And specifically
with
only
no limitations.
On Stanley Kubrick movies. He lent all of his energy, his time, his personal ambition. He gave up everything that made him in service of another person's vision. And as Matthew Modine says in the movie, that's so incredibly rare in the film industry, where you sacrifice all of your personal life and your own personal ambition in service of a filmmaker who you regard as the great director of the 20th century. And that's how Leon Vitali thought of Kubrick. So he felt like it was like he was being given a privilege to be in service of this grand vision. He was just so in awe of what Kubrick was up to. But I feel like 1 or 2 days working for Kubrick would probably kill those illusions or kill those feelings in most people.
Yeah.
Most people at the end of Kubrick movies are ready to go home and they never want to see him again.
They even talk about it. I think it was...
like Ryan O'Neal.
Yeah.
Like when they said, you can go, he's like, I'm going to go hide and never come back.
Because he thought if I don't leave now, they might call me back to get some more shots.
And Leon Vitali was signing up voluntarily, even after Kubrick's death for like the last 20 years, has been essentially working for free for the preservation and the integrity of Kubrick's work and Kubrick's vision. He's probably the most selfless film worker in the history of the biz.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the nicest guys, and just so loyal and smart. I mean, he gets it. He didn't know all this at the time, but he learned it all on the job, by doing, which of course is the best way to learn, by doing. But if you're going to have to learn all of these aspects of the filmmaking process, why not learn them at Stanley Kubrick's side?
Well, also, it's one of those things where if you're supervising prints being shipped out around the world, if you're supervising the preservation of films, and you know that if Kubrick finds a mistake in your work, that he's going to make you feel like you want to die, it teaches you to be a perfectionist. And when they're trying to preserve Barry Lyndon, how the studio kept complaining, well, you're just looking for things to complain about. He's like, no, I'm just trying to get it right. I know the way it's supposed to look. I know the way the color's supposed to be. I'm not looking for things to complain about. But this is the movie that Kubrick made, and what you've released is not Kubrick's movie.
Right. And he would know better than most what Kubrick was intending for the film to look like. I mean, there's a lot of controversy about,
like, the color of the ball in The Shining is still wrong. The color of the tennis ball, the Rolls of the Danny, is pink in most prints. It was a tennis ball. Tennis balls are not pink. Right. And then in earlier versions of the movie, you can see that the tennis ball is yellow. Why it's pink now in every release of the movie? It's just it's Warner Brothers fucking up.
It's just sloppy work on the part of Warner Brothers. They're not taking the time to check things. We recently working with Bill Plimpton. We're working with the Academy to restore one of his first films, Guard Dog. And,
not first film.
First Oscar-nominated film. And it's first dog film, I should say. And, when we got the first scan back, the colors were different than Bill remembered. So we had, he had to search through old artwork and scans to find what they were supposed to look like, because he just felt they were off.
Because as much as I love and adore Bill, I don't 100% trust his memories to be entirely. Like Kubrick, you'd be like, he probably knows what the color's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Bill, I'm like, are you sure?
But in this case, we could ask John. John is like the Leon Vitali of Bill Plimpton.
Absolutely. We're going to make a documentary, Filmworker 2, about John Holder-Reed.
That's right. Who will be joining the podcast in a few weeks.
For our solo episode.
That's right. Which won't be solo. It'll be 3 of us. But
it'll be a trio.
A trio. A trio for solo. But yeah, the film is very well made. It was shot, produced, edited, and directed by Tony Zira, who did a terrific job. It is definitely a work of passion on his part as well. They were actually looking a couple years ago. They reached out to me and Matthew. Of course, they wanted to interview Matthew about Leon, they worked together for 2 years in Full Metal Jacket. And they had asked me, because I had worked on the Full Metal Jacket Diary project, if I had any photographs of Leon and Stanley that hadn't been used or that they could have access to. So I started doing some additional searching through my archives I scanned hundreds and hundreds of images from different, not just from Matthew, but from extras and crew members that worked on the set of Full Metal Jacket. And we only used a fraction of them for the app that we released. So I never really was looking for pictures of Leon. I was looking for pictures of Matthew or of Stanley.
But he's easy to find a pic. He's got a distinctive look.
But I was able to find quite a few of them. Some of them needed a little bit of work, because we didn't really fully restore them, not thinking we were going to need to use them. So I was able to sort of get them cleaned up and offered them over to the filmmakers to use.
And they give the app a shout out in the
credits. And they do. Yeah,
they
actually, not only do they use a dozen or so images that we found of Leon, but they also include some of the audio that we recorded of Matthew reading his diary that he kept on the set. So there's a whole section where he talks about Leon in his diary, meeting him for the first time, and what his role was. He actually thought Leon was like a spy, Kubrick spy, because he would constantly be coming over to the actors, talking to them, and they all the actors on Full Metal Jacket thought that he was trying to catch them, smoking dope or something. They were. That's
when Modine talked about how Leon would refer to Winnebagos as Winnebagos.
Yeah, Winnebagos.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's there's a little section in the documentary about the Full Metal Jacket years, and there's a lot of Matthew's photographs and other photographs that we found, as well as some of the audio from the diary. But if you like that section, definitely check out the Full Metal Jacket Diary iPad app, or we have an audiobook version that's on Amazon and iTunes and Audible, and that's essentially an easy way for anybody. Just if they just want to listen to it, you don't need an iPad. You can just download it and listen. It's about 4+ hours.
Yeah, it fucking rocks.
Yeah.
Well, what I love most about this movie is that it dispels so much of the silly notions about Kubrick out there. Everyone likes to think of Kubrick as this basically like remorseless, like computer-like entity, incapable of human empathy or emotion, that he's just like this very cold, calculating person. And nothing could be further from the truth. And when you see just Leon Vitali just basically breaking down in tears at different times, remembering certain interactions he had with Kubrick, and just how funny and how abrupt he could be. And I love how when he finally found out he was going to play a part in Eyes Wide Shut, he just comes like, all right, I've decided you're playing the part, and it's kind of hung up on him. But they had a really interesting shorthand, and how as Leon Vitali's responsibilities increased and grew, and Kubrick continued to rely upon him more and more, it seems like that's when he encountered the really tough side of Kubrick, because as your responsibilities increase, so do Kubrick's demands and
the stakes are higher.
Absolutely. And so the relationship got increasingly complicated as Leon Vitali became increasingly important in the Kubrick overall kind of machinery. But I love how he's doing this part wearing these like 8-inch boots in order to seem tall and imposing during like those crazy erotic like orgy sequences and everything. Right. But how in between takes he was still having to like run up and down hallways and do tasks for Kubrick. It's like, no, you don't get a day off. You just get additional work on top of the shit that you're already doing for Kubrick, but everything else still has to get done.
Yeah, Kubrick wasn't going to find a new Leon Vitali now.
Absolutely.
He still needed Leon to do what Leon did. And he played several roles, I believe, in that scene. It wasn't just the Grand Master, I think, was
that,
one
but
of
at least that's the line that has all the dialogue.
Yeah, exactly.
Asking about the password for the for the
Yeah.
door versus the interior and that sort of thing. But he's incredible. I mean, it makes you almost kind of sad. Goddamn, but between Barry Lyndon and Eyes Wide Shut, that's like 24 years of movies that could have starred Leon Vitali. But we got kind of deprived of.
Yeah, and that's really that's what this movie is about. What caused Leon to give up a very promising acting career.
He was working. He was doing TV. He was doing theater. He was doing film. It's not like he was like an aspiring actor.
Right.
He was a working actor, which is what most actors aspire to be.
Right. And after Barry Lyndon, it was very likely that that would have been his sort of breakout role. He did take that Frankenstein movie, but beyond that, I don't know if there was any more roles that he took, because he essentially had made up his mind that at that point he was interested in the behind the scenes aspects of filmmaking. Something just switched in him, and again, they interview many of his former acting friends and colleagues
and his kids. I mean, his kids, if they wanted to see their father, they basically had to go sit on the floor of like Kubrick's mansion and just like hang out with like piles of like film reels and watch their dad make telephone calls.
Right,
like that was their family bonding. Because he would just sit there for days on end, chain smoking cigarettes, not bathing, not sleeping. He would like curl up on a mat by the door for 2 hours and wake up and keep working. I mean, he basically worked himself sick. And they talk about when they were about to release Eyes Wide Shut, obviously because Kubrick had died before the release, he was trying to supervise every single print that was going out, and it seemed like he even like redoubled his efforts in the absence of Kubrick, because he no longer could use Kubrick as leverage to get things done. Like once upon a time, when he would call somebody and they were dicking him around, eventually he could say like, "Don't make me like tell on you" to Stanley, which was like a big threat.
Right.
Once Kubrick was dead, people really started dicking Leon Vitali around in a big way. He was treated horribly at Warner Brothers. It's so sad and pathetic that he is treated as horribly as he is, when so much of what we love and adore about Kubrick that has been preserved is due to his work, his tireless, selfless efforts.
Yeah, most of, as you mentioned earlier, most of the sort of home media releases of the past 15 years are thanks to Leon and his sort of supervision of those transfers, and they're continuing to do it. As I said, they're doing a 4K release of 2001. I'm sure as 4K is becoming more popular, I'm sure they're going to go back and do brand new scans of every one of Kubrick's films. If any filmmaker deserves it, it's Kubrick. And Leon, I hope he's still involved with that, because he would be the right person to continue ensuring that the quality is there. Because if you look at different releases over the years, from VHS to Laserdisc to DVD and Blu-ray, they're all over the map. I mean, there's really and
even the crummy versions are still powerful. I mean, I fell in love with Clockwork Orange watching the shittiest pan and scan VHS imaginable. I think I even bought like a used copy of it for like my home personal use, and I was still like, this is the coolest movie ever. Little did I know just how much I was missing by watching it in such an inferior format.
Well, I recently read too that, and this isn't really covered in the film, I was hoping it would be, but that during starting with, I think Eyes Wide Shut, Full Metal Jacket, The Shining, and I think Barry Lyndon, Barry Lyndon. Basically, what I'm getting to is that there was an issue with aspect ratios with Kubrick. He had different aspect ratios that were permissible for every movie. And
also, and
people argue about,
and the aspect ratio changes sometimes in the middle of the fucking movie. You can see that with like Dr. Strangelove.
Right.
And I was never quite sure, is that deliberate or is that different sources being used for this particular transfer?
Yeah, well, Dr. Strangelove is a problem because they lost the negative, as the film talks about, and that was, for the longest time, they only had what they had available to source from it. But for starting, once home video came about and people were watching, and also television, people were watching movies on essentially 4x3 square boxes in their homes. He didn't like the fact that films would be cut, with
cropped on the side.
Cropped in size. So what he started doing was shooting with, I think, The Shining was the first film that he did it. He went 100% all in, because he knew that most people will be watching this on VHS at home. So he started to do a process where he would film it in the 4x3 ratio on 35 millimeter, but put everything important within the 185 or 166 frames within that, so that he could put the full screen image on a VHS.
As opposed to 2001,
and it's still his competition.
Exactly. 2001, which got murdered and wrecked by VHS.
So even if it was on VHS in not widescreen, it
You're
still
seeing
was
a
his
good product.
composition.
Because I remember in college, when I first got really snobby about widescreen movies, I remember renting the Laserdisc of Clockwork Orange from the library and saying, I'm finally going to see it in widescreen.
Yeah.
And I remember putting it in, I was like, that's it?
Because it was only 166 to 1, which is
I was like,
slightly wider than...
I was like, this is the same fucking shit. But I remember it never even occurred to me, just because something is not 4x3, there's, with that tweet that went completely berserk on you recently when you showed all the different aspect ratios. I think you got like 20,000 retweets or something.
I haven't looked at it
something
lately, but
something insane. But it was I think it literally had like millions of impressions.
Yeah, I don't know what happened, and I didn't like tag it. It just like
it took off.
It had its own.
But
life.
I didn't realize at that time that there were different versions of widescreen, and obviously there's like 6 or 7 different like shapes that a movie can be shot in.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what. So people debate continuously about like what's the right version of Full Metal Jacket or for Barry Lyndon or for
Barry Lyndon's 177, right?
I think so. 166 is what most people believe is the proper ratio for that film, although it is often projected in 185. Again, these are very minute changes, but Kubrick fans are very particular about it.
Also, because Kubrick had total mastering control over the frame, you want to see the frame that he intended you to see.
But because, again, the one thing that's interesting about 35 millimeter is a 4x3 frame, and the only reason we have widescreen is because you mat it in the projection room. Now, that's not true for CinemaScope, which is 235 or wider, like Super Panavision, which is what they filmed 2001 on. That's an anamorphically squeezed image into a 4x3 frame that the lens stretches it out to make it wide. So that always is that cannot be changed. Like that's wide. That's a widescreen image. You would have to either pan and scan across those images with a computer, which is horrible, or you would have to chop off the sides in any given shot. So, and sometimes they would,
or even worse, when you sometimes like they just kind of push in from the sides and make everything. I remember seeing like the closing credits of movies as a kid. First time I saw The Warriors, the closing credits, everybody got like really elongated because they pushed the frame together. And I was like, But I remember at the time thinking like, oh, this must be a thing. When the movie ends, you just squeeze everything and make everybody tall and weird looking. I thought it was like an artistic choice.
Yeah, no, it's just this dilemma that it's finally been resolved with widescreen televisions, but for decades
it still
and
gets
decades.
Fucked up. The other night I was watching something on Amazon. It was a Stars transfer of a movie. It was not Compañeros. God damn it, it's a Michael Curtiz film starring John Wayne from 1960. Not Compadres. I'm not gonna remember. In any case, early 60s. Comancheros.
Yeah.
I was watching Comancheros. Opening credits looked gorgeous, but as soon as the credits were over, it went from 2.35 to 1 to 1.85 to 1.
See?
And I was like, fuck you, Stars! You piece of shit! Because then it ruined my ability to digest the rest of the movie.
There's this, and HBO is doing this, there's this thought process that people want the image to fill the screen.
To fit their screen.
So,
because they're
and that's
fucking
essentially
children.
what Kubrick was stating. He was never saying that the films should be in one ratio or the other. It was dependent on where you were viewing it. Essentially, what he didn't want was it to be chopped up to fit any given screen. So if it's projected on a big screen, even though there's more information on a 4:3 frame above and below, he still wanted it to project it in 166 or 185, depending on the film. But if it was on VHS or some on a 4:3 screen, he wanted it full screen because
he basically removed the matte as opposed to chopping off the sides additionally.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because a lot of times what people will do is they'll take the widescreen image and chop off the sides. Like, no, just go back to the original negative, remove the matte, and you've got a 4:3 image.
And the thing that he was smart about is that he made sure that everything in the above and below where the matte would normally go still looked great. Like, he made sure the composition still worked, whereas a lot of times that's where
it's hard to do. You're basically having to frame and visualize your movie twice. It's hard enough to get it right just once.
It's true. And that's Kubrick, though. And other directors also would often have boom mics or equipment in those areas that you would cover up. So he made sure that everything looked
or like just like crew members, like just like accidentally like getting caught on.
Yeah,
film.
Exactly. So that's just, again, it's something that seems to only have happened with Stanley Kubrick, but he was very particular about the experience at home. He did not want, he wanted people to see it in a way that he approved without it being altered, but he also didn't want it to be like a tiny little, widescreen image on a, 20-inch television where it's hard to see.
Because I definitely had those weird experiences like in the late 90s on crummy TVs where I would insist upon seeing Blade Runner as it's supposed to be or The Wild Bunch how it's supposed to be.
But there's like no resolution.
And there's just like this tiny little image and I was like, all right, but it's still widescreen. It's good. But
I was one of those too. I would insist upon watching the widescreen, but as I said, you're only seeing then in a 2.35 to 1 film, you're only seeing like 1/3 of the screen has an image on it. So you're losing so much resolution. The phases are getting so small, and it's like, what's the trade-off? Bigger, zooming in and having a bigger image to see the performances, or seeing the full composition. I always prefer to see the full composition, but
it drives me
Kubrick's
crazy
solution was almost the best of both worlds.
But with the streaming crap, there's a big problem because, say it's like The Last Picture Show. I remember renting The Last Picture Show, and once again they fucked it up and played it 1.85 to 1. And all I can do is on my little Amazon reviews, I say great movie but wrong aspect ratio. I just say that every time. Great movie but wrong aspect ratio, because I just want people to know. Because if people don't know, they're being basically sold something that they're not getting what they pay for. It's just out of ignorance that people don't complain.
Yeah. Well, I've been really happy. I've said this before, but I've been really happy with the quality control on iTunes lately, because what they're doing, even for films, so widescreen TVs are the closest you can get to 1.85 to 1, but they're really 1.77 to 1 or some 7.8 to 1, slightly less. So, but a lot of those 1.85 to 1 films on iTunes actually don't fill the screen. They actually have little black bars on top, and I'm like, that's correct. I want that. I don't want them to zoom in just a little bit, which is what most of these streaming services do.
TV has got a weird thing going on now where there are a lot of TV shows that are shot in this new aspect ratio of just 2 to 1. And like Star Trek Discovery, it was 2 to 1. I was like, whoa, that's kind of cool. I've never seen just straight up 2 to 1 before, but I think as people get used to seeing their TV in 2 to 1 and they want to see it the way that it's intended to be shown, it will make people demand to see things in the proper aspect ratio.
And that's the benefit of sort of this new digital filmmaking that we have, which is how they're filming all these shows now, is that you're really you can make it whatever aspect ratio you want in the post-production process. As long as you've composed it beautifully, you can crop it however you want and deliver whatever format you need to. It doesn't. In the old days on film, you were constricted to the aspect ratio of the film frame, and then the matting, of course, in the projection room. So as the most common aspect ratios, around 1:3:3 to 1, 1:8:5 to 1, 2:3:5 to 1. Those are 2001, which we've been talking about, was 2.2 to 1, so it was slightly different. Not to get too nerdy about this stuff, but it's
Kubrick would appreciate the attention to detail.
These things matter to Kubrick, and they matter to a lot of film fans, that they're getting to see things the proper way.
Well, when I read a book, I don't want any pages missing. If I look at a painting, I don't want any sections of it blocked off. If I hear a piece of music, I don't want it to cut off before the song's over. And when I watch a movie, I want to see the fucking movie.
Yeah.
I don't want to see a condensed, cropped, abbreviated version. It's a pictorial medium, so let me see the fucking picture.
Yeah. Well, and this goes back to the beginning of the widescreen era, in the mid-50s. So,
Speaking of widescreen, did you see those images going around on Twitter the other day where Martin Scorsese basically drew, as like a 10 or 11-year-old kid, all the storyboards for a widescreen historical epic that he had cooked up? But it was an image that had basically like 50 of the images all kind of like stacked in there. But even as a little boy, and he was watching all these widescreen spectaculars, he was falling in love with CinemaScope and that sort of thing, drawing all this stuff. But getting back to Filmworker, I think there's a great scene where it really showed the contrast between an actor / filmworker like Leon Vitali versus a very highly respected, hardworking actor like Stellan Skarsgård, where they were interviewing him. He's talking about how, well, he loves to work and he loves the intimacy of a film crew and a film set and what goes on. How when the movie's over, he's gone. Like he's like in my spare time, I'm either cooking or fucking. I was like, you're my kind of guy. Like, here you are, like 60, and still admitting that if you're not working and making movies,
he's Swedish, right?
Yeah,
it's such a Swedish thing to say.
Absolutely. But he likes to eat and spend time with his friends
right.
and make love to beautiful women and that sort of thing. But I was like, he has downtime. He has relaxation. He's obviously enjoying life. I don't get the sense that Leon Vitali he enjoyed the fruits of their labors, but it doesn't seem like there was a lot of like cooking and or fucking outside of the work he was doing for Stanley
And it's
Kubrick.
not like he was this single guy. He had children and a family. It's like he just wasn't around. He made a choice. Yeah. Right. If you know something if you want to do something and you want to do it well and you can put 100% of yourself into it, then with no distractions, that's the ideal situation.
Kubrick would cease in his labors if he had a sick dog. His big thing he loved collecting animals, and if a dog was dying or sick, he basically couldn't function, and all of his time and energy was spent looking after this dying animal. But when the animal finally would expire, he'd be like, all right, now where are we on this? Where are we on this? And we'd just start calling Leon. But how like there's that one like paralyzed cat that couldn't move anymore, and they set it like up a bed with all these video cameras, like so at any given time he could look at the monitors and see how his dying cat was doing. I mean, Kubrick's such a fucking loon.
Yeah, and that reminds me of that story from Matthew's diary about when they were moving these potted palm trees around because they only had 20 or so Spanish palms.
Faking a tropical landscape in the UK.
And they were moving. At one point, they moved them and they crushed a family of rabbits in a hole. And when Kubrick found them and saw them, he just stopped working for hours. I forget exactly how long, but he just it really affected him. And he just kind of stared at them for a while. And I think that shows his
never
humanity.
mind all the black smoke they're vomiting into the sky and befouling the environment. But you crush some sweet little bunny rabbits. Yeah. Work must stop. Because when you look at those scenes, like the battle scenes, how much shit are they just vomiting into the sky? It's some thick black gross smoke, and
it was already a gasworks company from World War I or II, I forget, that was out of no longer working. So who knows what chemicals and crap were already in the soil and in the area. It's just
don't
it was
eat
called
the dirt.
Becton Gasworks. It was not, as Matthew said, it was a poisonous place in many regards.
But it looked good on film. I mean, when I watched Full Metal Jacket, I don't know how many times as a kid. Never once did I think, they're not in Vietnam, they're in the UK.
Yeah.
You fucking believe it when you watch it.
Yep, and again, Stanley didn't like to travel, so he wasn't filming
Say
in
that
Vietnam.
Barry Lyndon is like,
Yeah.
well, let's make this giant, sweeping historical epic, but it all has to be able to be shot within like 10 miles of my home. It's like, what? Like,
But that, I think, is the way that Kubrick was able to have that life-work balance. That he, because he had daughters and a wife and all his pets and his big mansion and
his busy reading schedule and
right.
guns to play with.
So if he could, and I think what he did is he brought them into the process. He included his family in the filmmaking process so that he was spending time with them even when he was working. And that way it was sort of a family affair. As I said, his brother-in-law, Jan Harlan, was his executive producer on many of the films.
And he did have a lot of downtime between films. Like when you're only making a movie every couple of years, because granted, as his career progressed, he would take longer and longer breaks because it almost seems like he was like rediscovering his craft and rediscovering his interests. And so, I mean, if he had gone from giant, like one Barry Lyndon to the next year after year after year, that would have destroyed him.
Yeah.
But after Barry Lyndon, you've got like 5 years before The Shining, and then you got like 7 or 8 years before Full Metal Jacket, then you got like 10 or 11 years before Eyes Wide Shut. That does allow a much more wholesome work-life balance.
And there were numerous films that I think he was developing, but for various reasons didn't quite kind of get where they needed to go.
But you're not putting in 20-hour days when you're writing a screenplay and collaborating and reading drafts.
But he did do a tremendous amount of work on his Napoleon film, and there's a great book that compiles like all the materials, all the assets, all the sketches, all the
Now
costumes.
it's going to be the follow-up to 2001 initially, correct?
Yeah, and it just got delayed and delayed and delayed, and I'm sure it would have eventually gotten made. But it's a giant book put out by Taschen, I think it's a.
And is there a shooting script in it?
Yeah, there is. So you could kind of put together almost like an animatic of the film if you wanted, with all
who wrote it?
The script, or
yeah,
I'm
the
not
script.
sure. I've not. I didn't check that, but I'm
He always worked with
I'm
such
sure
great
he was
material, but obviously
partially involved in the writing of the script.
Like he wasn't like he was ever like typing things out, but he was finding the books and he was browbeating his screenwriters into his submission to get what he wanted. But it is really incredible just how great the scripts are. I mean, if you look at 2001, where the script is like so bare bones, versus Clockwork Orange, where it's so like narration heavy and so plot driven, just totally different animal.
Yeah.
But I love the voiceover in Barry Lyndon is great. The voiceover in Clockwork Orange is great. The voiceover in Full Metal Jacket is incredible. Even the little bits of voiceover in Dr. Strangelove is great. Like that's one thing they always tell you. Voiceover is a crutch of the crappy screenwriter. Not in Kubrick movies. Voiceover is incredible.
Yeah, and although I'm glad there wasn't any in 2001, that's the one movie where I think it would have changed the film drastically.
Like with Blade Runner.
Yeah,
the movie's better without
exactly.
it. Sorry, Guillermo del Toro, but you're wrong. Well, any final words on Filmworker and Leon Vitali and the legacy of Leon Vitali and or Kubrick before we start?
Yeah, I just think anyone that has ever, if you're a Kubrick fan, obviously you got to see this film. If you've ever worked on a movie in any way, shape, or form, this is a good movie to see because it really does shine a light on sort of those unsung heroes, those people that don't get a lot of credit and acknowledgement. Typically, it's the actors and directors, sometimes the producers, but most of the rest of the people involved are just kind of it's a job, and they're working tirelessly, and this does sort of shine the spotlight on those people. Leon is one of many thousands and thousands of film workers out there that just don't get I think every director, every great director has somebody or people like Leon that have worked with them for long stretches of time to help them be great. And I think Leon, this is that story for Stanley. This is the story of how Stanley found this guy, Leon Vitali, and turned him into his, devoted follower and assistant for better part of 3 decades. And
it's almost like they could have formed the world's coolest cult if they'd let a few more people into the inner circle.
That's right. But it's opening this weekend at the Metrograph Theater in New York City. I think so. That's this May 11th. It's opening, I think, May 18th in the UK. For those listening across the pond.
Any plans for the online release?
Yeah, and they do have a VOD release I don't have the exact date on me. I don't know if they've actually announced it yet, but because it's doing this kind of roadshow type city tour first, I believe. But Kino Lorber did pick it up for distribution after a very successful film festival run. And they're sort of like a boutique distribution company, and they seem to be giving it the loving care that it needs to find its audience, and hopefully a lot of people will come out this weekend to see it in the theater. I think it's there for 2 weeks, guaranteed. And of course, if it's successful, like any independent film, it might carry over to additional weeks
or spread to some other theaters.
Exactly, or other theaters in the city might take a chance with it. It's just harder and harder with all the VOD and streaming services to get people to go out to see a documentary.
Yeah, to see an independent film and or a classic film in the theater, I definitely struggle sometimes with the motivation. In spite of the embarrassing number of extraordinary theaters we have in New York, more often than not, my theater-going experiences are for Infinity War or Isle of Dogs. Like, Isle of Dogs is obviously not like a Marvel movie, but it's still a Wes Anderson big movie and that sort of thing. Yeah. So that tends to be the majority of my theater-going experiences.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just a matter of wanting to see it, be one of the first to see the film, so you're part of the conversation. Whereas sometimes independent films and documentaries, people don't feel that urgency that they might have with Infinity War.
Also, this might sound mean. There are a lot of independent films and documentaries that just aren't that good.
That's true.
Like just because you're low budget doesn't mean you're brilliant.
No,
I think sometimes people think, oh, it's a micro budget movie. This is the real art. It's like, no, that people are full of shit on the small scale and on the large scale. And it's like there's always great work to be found, irrespective of the scale of the particular movie.
This legitimately has been getting rave reviews from not just festivals, but the New York Times gave it a great review today. Rolling Stone.
I love it. I mean, I've seen it twice, and I absolutely was floored by it. I love it.
It has been praising it. It was voted one of the top films that you have to see in May, which, there's a lot of big movies coming out. So for a little movie like this to get up there with movies like Solo.
Go see Deadpool 2 or Filmworker. But I just think it's remarkable. I mean, I said at the beginning of the episode, but here we are, 2018. And with so many filmmakers that I love, I mean, 20th century filmmaking is kind of my thing, but 20s and 30s and 40s, those early days, are really my thing. And most of those great directors from that period are seen to be with great, almost like an alarming rate of decay, just vanishing into the ashes of time, where young film goers and young filmmakers are really talking about like the 70s and 80s forward, which I think is a huge disservice to basically the first 100 years of movies in a lot of ways. But Kubrick is the exception, where his career started in the 50s. He seems to get a little bigger, a little grander, a little more revered with each passing year. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if 100 years from now, some podcasting dorks are sitting around talking about the 150th anniversary of 2001 and how it's still a jaw-dropping, awe-inspiring movie.
I mean, it's true. I mean, we're coming up on that graphic you mentioned earlier. I included the widest film ever, or the widest scene was from Napoleon in 1927. Which
was like 3 cameras shooting simultaneously. It wasn't even like the same image. It was like they cheated. They did 3 images and shoved them side by side.
Exactly, and they had to project them with 3 sort of perfectly synchronized projectors on a wide screen.
Like if one of them's even a half second off, the whole movie's ruined.
Exactly.
And it was just for certain sequences. It wasn't like the whole movie.
It was just for some big war battle scenes in the end of the film.
Which means in the middle of the movie, these other projectors have to come on.
And this is a 5.5-hour film.
Yeah.
5.5 hours.
And the technology, 100 years ago, a lot of things.
And that's what I was getting at. I said that's coming up in 2027 will be its 100th anniversary. And here we're still talking about that film now. So if we're talking about that movie, 1927, and it's 2018, there's no question that in 50 more years, we'll be talking about
the 100th anniversary of 2001, without question.
Yeah. So
and we'll probably still be thinking, they were really ambitious about the evolution of technology. We're still not where they predicted we would be in 2001. Right.
We probably won't be. Unless, here's the difference, though. I think we were depending back in the 60s on essentially the governments of the world getting us into space. What's probably going to change, and it is, with
the Elon Musks of the world turning it into a business.
It's going to be a privatization.
That's when you get the Hilton in space.
Yeah, exactly. Which that's probably how it happened, is that they had all these corporate sponsors and to help get things built in space.
If Hilton opened a hotel in space where you had to pay $50,000 a night to go up there for a night and then come right back, there'd be some freaks who would go. I promise. I mean, fucking guys like what the hell? Who's that guy who runs Amazon?
Jeff Bezos.
Jeff Bezos. Yeah. He'd probably like throw a party up there, but I'm gonna take my 100 closest friends, and I'm just gonna rent the place out for a month.
Take his top 100 employees, you know, up there for a retreat.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of youngsters like to scream and rant and rave about how much they hate capitalism, but sometimes capitalism gets shit made.
Well, that's my point. Is
like
it
movies,
might come down to that.
Things where people buy tickets and they go see something that an enterprising visionary has made. That's capitalism. Sorry.
Yeah. Or your craft beer. People have to pay for it, don't they? You know.
Yeah, I think sometimes. I mean, I'm at 41. I'm still very naive and simple about many matters. But sometimes when I see 20-year-olds talking on Twitter, I'm like, y'all are too dumb to live. But you will learn.
Well, I also, speaking of Twitter and speaking of, the films that younger people are watching, I sometimes we get tweeted these questions like, tweet your favorite sci-fi movie or your favorite movie that you watched during the summer growing up, and sometimes you get back, answers that are movies that are like 4 or 5 years old. You're like, wow, this person is probably like 18.
They're a child. That's great. Yeah, they're teenagers. Like when I was 18, it says, what's your favorite summer movie? At age 18, what would that have been? 1994. What the hell would I have considered to be like a classic of my childhood? I probably would have said like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom or something like that. But everyone's one of those 80s
Batman
movies. It would have seemed equally ridiculous at that time as well. So
to someone who was 40.
Batman, when it came out when I was 12 or 13, I lost my fucking shit.
Yeah, it was a game changer at least for a superhero movie on the big screen.
Yeah, I love unbridled enthusiasm. Like even if someone likes some questionable movies, as long as they're stark raving mad about the subject of movies, then they're no wrong.
Passionate
answers.
about it, then it's not wrong.
Yeah.
Where we do have a problem though is getting them to then also go back and look at what inspired that movie that they like, and to help them, just like with music, you can like, whatever you want to like, but you do sort of have to have a basic understanding of music history and who inspired who to get to where we are today.
What's funny though is when I talk about movies and books, and I totally agree, however, it's one of the things where like I like 20th century literature quite a lot, but almost never do I read 19th century literature. And I'm sure someone could say, well, if you're going to appreciate 20th century literature, you have to have a working understanding of 19th century literature. Like, but that was really hard. Those books are really long and they're hard. Like I've read Moby Dick and I've read Count of Monte Cristo and stuff like that. These are old ass books and they're really big, but they ain't exactly quick to get through. So.
No. Yeah, I just think the visual medium of film, people take a lot more from what they've seen. Like we were saying, all these filmmakers that have been inspired by 2001 or just by Kubrick in general. There's no question that filmmakers copy each other or at least borrow from one another. And to not see those connections, I think, is doing the film that you love a disservice. You're not seeing the roots of that film. You're not seeing what came before it to make it possible. And I just find that this is an ongoing discussion on social media about how do we get the younger generation to watch more classic films.
But they said the same thing in the 90s. When I was getting into movies, it wasn't like every kid in my class was getting into old movies. Like in my fraternity or even in my film classes. These were film history courses.
Sure. Yeah.
I would be the one kid in the class that actually liked the movies we were watching. Like we were watching, I remember we saw like Little Caesar, and it came into class, and it was like movie 1931, and I was going berserk over how much I loved it.
Mobster movie.
Yeah, Edward G. Robinson. But I was a big gangster movie fan, but I love stuff like The Godfather, Mean Streets, and Scarface, like the obvious stuff. But I'd never seen any 30s gangster movies, and I was just floored. I was like, oh, there's so many more gangster movies for me to see that I haven't seen yet. And that's how I got to see the original Scarface and Public Enemy and Roaring Twenties.
Petrified Forest.
But I came into class and I was like, and everybody's like, what's wrong with you? So I think sometimes people think today's generation is dumb and that somehow it's like an exception to the norm. My generation was fucking stupid too.
I just think that what the argument might be is that the younger, and I don't know how young you want to go, but that the younger generation right now is spending so much time on social media that they don't have the time to go back like that. They basically replaced when we were renting VHS tapes of old movies, but we didn't have social media to distract us.
Cat videos on YouTube.
Right, exactly. That they're being distracted by really short form content.
Yeah, but I watched a lot of worthless episodes of Mr. Belvedere and things like that. Like there were some. I invested some crack level hours in some really questionable programming from like age 6 to 15. When I went to boarding school, my TV stopped for 4 years because I had no TV at boarding school. So there was just no TV from 15 to 18. But prior to that, there's some shows where I could have probably used those hours in a better way. So I'm not going to throw a bunch of stones because I very much live in a glass house when it comes to some of the choices I made as a teen. I didn't need to see Universal Soldier 50 times. Maybe 3 or 4 would have been sufficient.
Right. Listen, I'm not throwing stones. People are entitled to like whatever they like. I just want to make sure there's access.
Yeah.
That's really what I'm getting at, is I want to make sure there's easy access for people to see these older films. And I worry because Netflix is getting rid of a lot of their catalog titles. Filmstruck's the way to go.
Yeah.
But it's going to get... It was easier when Netflix had so many classic films because it was all in one place.
Yeah.
And it's going to be harder to get
now
these
it's going to be
people...
little teeny tiny packages.
Right. And it's going to be harder to get somebody to sign up for Filmstruck because they're going to think, oh, that's just like for independent foreign movies or classics, and I don't like that stuff. So whereas before, it might recommend a classic film to you on Netflix because you watched a film that was of the same genre, and it might open your eyes to something you didn't know before. So that's what I'm getting at.
But I think a lot of kids now look at Netflix as a generator of original content. Like I remember a couple of years ago, you'd always hear, "Is that on Netflix yet?" I don't hear that very frequently because I think now people recognize Netflix is not acquiring old movies really anymore. Right. Netflix is creating so oftentimes some really insanely cool shows, but they're just looked at like Stars or like AMC. They're just yet another platform that's creating content.
Or like HBO, where they have a selection of kind of catalog titles that are there for a limited period, like for a window of time, but you're really buying into the original content, or live sports that they have or whatever. It's like you're there for that original content that's exclusive to that platform. So it's an ongoing discussion or debate, I guess you would say, about how do we make sure that people have access to or have the choice, exposure to these classic films, not forcing them to watch it, obviously. But
it's a weird thing. I think you got to start them young. I remember sitting down, Nicholas and Olivia, my younger, they're 16 now, but they were like 3 or 4, and I sat them down and showed them this old Charlie Chaplin short. He made this series of 12 films called The Mutual Films, and one of them is called 1 a.m., and it's like an 8-minute movie where a guy comes home drunk, and it's just fucking up. He just keeps stumbling into things. He can't get into his house. He can't get out of the car. He can't get upstairs. Like, he's just fucking everything because he's wasted.
Yeah.
It's funny as hell. And they were so little and so young. They just kept saying, "Why is he so funny? Why is he so funny?" And I was like, "Oh, he's a silly guy." And we giggled like crazy. And then they put it behind him. So there was no pressure to, you have to like this because he's a genius. Like all that stupid nonsense. I think you'd have to just remind people these stories are fun, and irrespective of the age of the movies, if they're fun is fun.
And I do think it has a lot to do with parents. If parents are excited to watch classic films, they'll introduce them to their children. I mean, as I said,
my dad showed me The Wild Bunch.
Right,
so.
Exactly. Or 2001, I watched, because my dad and older brother watched it, and so I was exposed to it. Same thing with films like The Graduate. My parents hadn't liked that movie, I probably wouldn't have seen it when I was younger. So their films that they were watching when they were in their 20s became their lifelong favorites, and so it carried over to
my nieces and nephews discovered Overboard recently because my brother-in-law loved Overboard as a kid. Yeah. And I remember, but I was watching it with them.
The Kurt Russell one.
Yeah. And they have a nanny from Afghanistan who's very conservative. And of course, like the first scene, Goldie Hawn's basically like nude with like butt floss walking around. In any case, I was looking at her, I was looking at the kids, I was looking at the screen, I was like, this could get weird, but she didn't say a fucking thing, but I could tell she did not approve. But they thought Overboard was funny as hell. And their age, at the time, they're 2, 3, and 4. And so, granted, I don't think Overboard's necessarily going to replace anybody's favorite movie from the 80s. Like, it's not going to like knock Blue Velvet out of the top spot.
Yeah.
But there are still kids out there watching stuff that is before their time.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think because when the age of live television was still, it's still around, but like you and me, we both have cut cable, so we don't just turn the TV and flip around anymore to see what's on.
Well, I got a Sling pack, which allows me a limited version.
Sure,
Sling,
you get a few live channels.
You pick your channels, but you're not picking among thousands. You're picking among like 20 that you've handpicked.
Exactly.
But Sling's the shit. I love Sling.
It still is different than when we were kids because we would just, what was on TV, we would just watch.
Yeah.
And
you pick the least shitty option.
Yeah.
And you sometimes would find some very strange
and you would sometimes
programs.
be exposed to something that was like really cool, and then maybe you would go out and rent it on VHS to see the whole thing because you always caught the end of it or whatever. But that was a way that you were sort of accidentally exposed to some classic movies. And again, there just aren't as many options to sort of stumble across. You have to be a little more deliberate and with an intention to find the films. They're out there. They're not hard to find. It's just that you have to have a purpose.
You have to hunt these things down or have them shown to you.
Exactly.
You're not going to just stumble into it by accident.
Right. And I know I stumbled onto many classic films.
But I also
television.
stumbled onto some less than stellar program as well. Like, well, fuck it. I got to watch something. So let's watch this.
Like Mr. Belvedere.
Yeah, dude. I saw easily 100 episodes of Mr. Belvedere.
Charles in Charge.
I wouldn't mind getting all that time back. Although
yeah.
Charles in Charge was it Nicole Eggert? Was that her name?
She was in it, yeah.
That's another topic for another day. In any case, where can people find you online?
I'm on Twitter.
Anything you want to promote?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Adam Rackoff, AdamRackoff, and I always try to follow everybody that follows me. So feel free to reach out if you'd like to continue this conversation in any way, shape, or form. I'm happy to talk about 2001 or Filmworker, which, as I mentioned, is opening this Friday in New York City, and as it becomes available on VOD or in other cities, I'll probably be tweeting about that, so follow me and I'll try to keep you posted on its availability. James and I also have our new short film, Cop Dog, which is now on iTunes, and
live action movie about a boy and his collie.
Exactly. It's called The Cop Dog. No, it's I was making that joke earlier that all the sequels today put the word "the" in front of them. The Wolverine, the Batman, the Predator.
Yeah.
Which the trailer just came out today.
Yeah, I was nonplussed by it. But.
Yeah, it's just like, but what? Like, what is this trend? Just like, okay, let's put the word "the" in front of it. It's more serious now, and so. So I was joking. The Cop Dog is on iTunes, which is a sequel to the Oscar-nominated Guard Dog, which I mentioned earlier. It's a really funny animated short by Bill Plimpton. It's $2.99. So if you like us,
literally drugs and sex, all it needs is a little rock and roll,
Yeah.
and you'd have the perfect triangle of entertainment value.
That's right. A great short to watch before 2001. So
Absolutely.
If you're putting together your viewing for this weekend. But it's like 5.5 minutes, so it's an easy, short watch for anybody that's interested. And
watching it and paying for it is a great way to support. If you like endeavors like Wrong Reel, which are content for free, when I put out something that is actually content you have to pay for, it helps support some of the other endeavors that I do for free.
Yes. And also, if you do purchase the film, we would love it if you could rate it and write a review on iTunes, because that also helps us and helps get more people interested in it.
It just makes the machinery direct people to it.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the big things right now. Working on some other projects in the early stages. So I don't have a lot else to share at the moment, but as I said, I try to keep people posted on Twitter, online. So if you follow me, I'll be sure to keep you posted.
And you'll be back in 2 weeks and a day for our solo episode. So if you like Adam Rackoff, he's going to be back at you in the very near future. But we got some fun stuff coming up. We got Kevin Marr for a Michael Ritchie episode. We got Marcus Penn for a Lars von Trier ep. I've got a buddy of mine, Brian Rule, who's a Muay Thai expert, come back to talk about Jim Kata. All sorts of fun stuff on the horizon. And, of course, you can always hunt down my YouTube channel, Geeking with James Hancock, where I'm typically just rant and rave about TV shows, but occasionally movies as well. But please consider subscribing to this podcast. Leave us a rating and review on whatever platform you might be enjoying it on. And that's about all I got to say. So thank you so much for listening. And as always, onwards and upwards.